You there?
Oh, I can see. You're good. You're good. All right.
Mary, are we ready?
Yep.
Okay. This is Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV in Washington, D.C. We welcome each and every one of you here. This is really an exciting event. You have key leaders from across the globe, particularly on the African continent, are going to be sharing their expertise, their wisdom, their knowledge, and most of all, their energy. And we'll be able to network with each and every one. But we have Dr. Oyobami Odare, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the ONI of the Global Outreach in Nigeria. And for the King himself, Ojiji II, and Bami, if I can call him that, is an outstanding world leader in his own right. He has a very keen mind, great wisdom, and insights as far what needs to be happening on the African continent. Bami, please take off, please, and share your time with us, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Sam. I appreciate that introduction. Yeah, well, good afternoon, everyone, from the United Kingdom, and rare greetings from His Imperial Majesty, the Oni of Ife, and who has saddled me with the obligation of representing his voice, at this special conference, who is regarded as one of the foremost monarchs in Africa, whose throne and royal mission is purely dedicated to reconstructing the greatness of Africa and rebuilding the wealth of those kingdoms that metamorphose into countries and republics. I must place on record at this junction the effort of the organizing committee that is ably led by its chairman, Mr. Aniete Fonle-Cornet, with a special mentioning of the coordinator of Watch Democracy Grow, Mrs. Mary. Endless gratitude to you all and the entire team. In response to the almost new normal of living with the COVID-19 pandemic and its unprecedented invasions of our global economy, I had contemplated greatly on what should form the central thesis of this opening remark, these historical nuances, relevant discourses, important facts, etc. I asked myself what would be the most effective way to communicate my thoughts and the thoughts of Watch Democracy Grow as an embodiment of new normal, meaning and development of Africa. I concluded that my best approach would be to speak straight, be practical and functional. My conclusion is based on the fact that majority of those on this platform are finding collective solutions to drive in transformational mechanism for the development of Africa democracy and its infrastructure. Most importantly, the citizens of Africa whose behalf this platform is convened are in a hurry to finding solutions. Unlike the proverbial tortoise who became very historical and restless after a decision has already been taken to get him out of shithole he has been for several years, I can say ours Africa has indeed peaked, become an emergency and a matter of life and death. This great conference is benchmarked on a comprehensive socioeconomic planning, model similar to the Marshall Plan of 1947. I hold the view that Africa is a continent that must concern all of us because Africa continues in many ways to punch below our economic credence. The question that we must ask is what must Africa do to transform our economy and by extension, the lives of people of Africa. This is a central thesis and discourse. I believe that this conference will be anatomizing. I equally submit that this isn't a new debate. In fact, I would like to submit to you that since Africa regained independence from the colonizer, the continent has been conscientiously negotiating the right economic path that best suits our development. Through the lenses of history, through spirit and past heroes that championed African independence, fought on the premise that they were going to transform a chart comprehensive socioeconomic pathway for Africa, so that in 1957, when Kwame Nkrumah said, "Seek ye first the political kingdom and the rest will be given unto you," it was synonymous to the biblical narratives of the voice of the one crying in the wilderness. Prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his path straight. Nkrumah summoned the comrades to rise above political independence to find a distinctive and unmistakable comprehensive economic approach that will free the continent for centuries to come. At the Congress of African Leaders towards African Unity in 1963 at Addis Ababa, Nkrumah was so passionate on that day that he said, "Let us not live here without a united Africa, with one currency, with one passport, with one army, with one police, with one economy." Because if we don't, the invader is not asleep. In a few years, they might begin to confuse us again, and we will never unite. It was a clarion call towards African integration in trade, transportation, migration, educational exchange, etc. Kwame Nkrumah was not a Jewish prophet, but no sooner had he settled down, the intervention by the Western influence started in earnest. It is no wonder, therefore, that the first generation leaders, many of them through the mechanization of these Western influences, were removed from power. Kwame himself was not spared. In 1966, he was removed, and many others. Such developments brought back in earnest the historical recollection of Berlin Conference of 1884, and up to the conclusion of the independence struggle. The period as dark night for the continent of Africa was unsettled in the minds of Kwame Nkrumah and others. During this dark period and through lenses of centuries of history, Africa has continued to remain a beautiful masterpiece. It is a continent which embodies many greatness and complexities of challenges. It is worthy of mentioning that Africa cannot be blamed as the architect of its past predicament. As according to the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair rightly said, Africa's predicament is a scare in the consciousness of the world. Such threats of history cannot be said to be unconnected to some of the perennial challenges that Africa is battling with, where some of our economic development templates are generated from the Europe or American culture. I attended a meeting in 2008 in Berlin as a scholar on the German Academic Exchange Service, DAD, and it was a high-level meeting for young Africans and Europeans to discuss how Europe will relate with Africa 50 years from then. Africa took the biblical instructions rather literally that we should not worry about tomorrow, that tomorrow will take care of itself. Tomorrow is not in the business of taking care of itself. Tomorrow is in the business of being taken care of. I therefore hold the view, therefore, that if Africa is to enjoy the comprehensive socio-economic development has been advocated for by the Watch the Democracy Growth today, Africa must deal with the fundamentals. I'm suggesting to Africa that one of the things that the continent must know is that the global economic connectivity is a positive indices that must be harnessed to the advantage of the continent. The Europeans are now planning how to negotiate with the continent for the next 100 years. The Chinese are currently engaging the continent with the vision of the next 75 years from today. So as the Asians, so as the Arab, because Africa is the land of opportunity, and as it has always been. African economy has been locked down on the decades of pandemics, systemic failure, and absolute reliance on aid. In contrast to the success of the Marshall Plan that was recorded in Western Europe after the World War II, aid to Africa over the 60 years since its independence has been a failure. I submit that aid has increased, Africa economy performance has declined. According to Lubamba, that great professor, said, I've never believed that Africa is going to pull out herself from the murky and mire of poverty by receiving donor money or integrating the design millennial project into our economic development. You cannot realize economic development of any human movement through the lenses of charity or gift aid alone. I must submit that what is in the best interest of Africa is to leverage on the I-5s of the African Development Bank, which stands on the pillars of Light Up and Power Africa, Feed Africa, Industrialize Africa, Integrate Africa, and improve the quality of life for the people of Africa. Africa needs to redesign its economic outlook and engage its diaspora community. Africa shouldn't be dependent only on external aids or foreign direct investment for its economic survival. For example, the classic rise of 2017-18 inflows of billions of dollars through the remittance schemes from Africa in diaspora to Africa is beginning to cast a doubt on the effectiveness.
We need to finish and move forward with our agenda. Thank you, sir. Closing statement.
Okay, yes, the closing statement is Africa must embrace Agenda 2063 as the continent new vision. Permit me to end this opening remark with Dr. Akinwumi Adesina's, the president of African Development Bank statement. The third that says, think of a continent that will have the same population as India and China, taken together by 2050. Think of a continent with a rising middle class, rapid urbanization that will have the young population in early by 2050. Think no further, think Africa.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Wise words from a wise man.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
for
Thank you.
being with us and sharing. We
Thank you,
really
thank you, thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you
We
so
will
much,
keep-
Dr. Yobani.
Thank you so much,
We will
Mary.
keep on time. We're very strictly monitoring, so with everyone, we'll stay within the time frame. And I think is Dr. Lawrence Freeman still here?
Yes,
There he
I am.
is. Hey, how you doing this morning? Thank you very much for being here. I have you down from 9:40 to 10 o'clock, and we'll finish with Q&A for about 5 minutes, and I will be timing, but thank you for being here and sharing your time and your wisdom from over 30 years on the African continent and with the African continent. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to be speaking to you all today and to participate on this webinar. I'm going to speak about the impact of COVID-19 on Africa and the world and on our thinking. What has happened is that the COVID-19 has revealed underlying weaknesses across the entire world, and now they're all there for us to see. The globalization was not a success. Gyrations on the stock markets do not indicate or represent real value for economic wealth. I've known this for a long time, and now I think other people are going to see this as well. The so-called advanced sector nations have actually, from the standpoint of physical economy, have been contracting for decades. It should be obvious to us here in the West that the cutbacks in healthcare infrastructure over the last 40 years have now shown themselves to produce a catastrophe as far as the United States and other advanced sector countries dealing with this crisis. In the developing sector, and in particular in Africa, we're looking at potential mass death potential with the COVID-19 intersecting the food crisis and other economic shortcomings. The failure for Africa to industrialize, as our other speaker mentioned, the fragile health infrastructure, massive poverty, the dependence on 1,000-mile-long food chains and supply chains, and food insecurity across the continent have made the Africans a potential hotspot beyond all others at this point. The conditions in Africa cry out for transformative change. Not a bit of tinkering here and there, but what is urgently needed is a new paradigm for development, and which I will refer to as the new Bretton Woods system. The United Nations Economic Commission on Africa, UNCA, said that the deaths on the continent from COVID-19 could be from 300,000 to 3 million. David Beasley, the director of the World Food Program, has said that 825 million people in the world are food insecure, with a large portion on the African continent. He reports that 135 million people actually are starving. Food insecure means they miss a meal a day, but 135 are starving, and that could increase to 265 million as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, because the impact of COVID-19 on shutting down borders, shutting down transportation, keeping people locked up in an economy that's fragile and weak, the results could be far worse in food starvation and death than they could be in COVID-19 itself, even though the COVID-19 is what's exacerbating the crisis. Beasley says that we could be seeing mass famine of 150,000 to 300,000 per day, with countries in Africa potentially could be the hotspots for this famine, including Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sudan, South Sudan, and Ethiopia. This is a very dangerous situation, and this intersection of the COVID-19 on the economies of the African continent are what is causing concerns and fears of experts throughout the world. And of course, this is what we have to correct, and actually should have never been the case. The World Bank forecast that economic growth for African countries for 2020 will decline from negative 2.1% to as high as negative 5.3%. Why is this the case? We have to look at the conditions in Africa. 60% of the world extreme poor that is approximately $1.90 a day or less. 60% of the world's extreme poor live on the African continent. 70% of the world population that lack electricity live on the African continent. Approximately 600 million people do not have access to electricity. 336 million people live in slums, which is over half the number of people who live in urban centers on Africa. 61% of the world's workforce, according to the International Labor Organization, are in the informal economy. In Africa, you have 86%. Now let's talk about the informal economy, because this is the problem. This is the problem of poverty, which is a propitious host to the disease. I mean, the informal economy, as we all know, is living hand to mouth, surviving, finding a way to survive that day or the next day, to make a little bit of money to bring home to your family to keep them alive. It is not a productive job. It is not a high-paying job. It is not a job with wages, security, health insurance, unemployment insurance. This is one of the great weaknesses of the failure to industrialize Africa, to have a robust manufacturing and agricultural sector, is absorbed in the informal economy, which is bad. It's a cancer, really, because it drags down the productive capabilities of its workforce, and it decreases the profit of the physical economy itself. These conditions, lack of electricity, lack of clean water, lack of sanitation, lack of productive jobs, lack of food, and massive poverty are the conditions of which COVID-19 now enters into Africa. And that is why so many of us and so many experts are very concerned about the potential death rate, even though it has not reached that level at this point. Nevertheless, the potential is there unless corrective measures are taken. And this is what we must be working on. Now, if you look at the question of the COVID-19 itself, I looked at the figures. Beginning in March 30th, 2020, there were 4,760 cases of COVID-19 on the continent and 146 deaths. Now, this may be underreporting throughout because Africa may not have the ability to have proper reporting of statistics. But let's work with these statistics. 4,760 cases, 146 deaths. As of June 15th, yesterday, there were 244,000 cases of COVID-19 and 6,546 deaths. Now, this is a very small percentage of the global number of people who have COVID-19 cases of 8 million approximately. But nevertheless, the growth is substantial, from 4,700 to 244,000, from 146 deaths to 6,500 deaths. Let's look at the two largest countries on the continent, sub-Saharan I'm talking about. On March 30th, South Africa had 1,280 cases and 1 death. Nigeria had 111 cases and 1 death. 10 weeks later, June 15th, South Africa has over 70,000 cases from 1,200, and Nigeria from 111 has 16,085. South Africa went from 1 death to 1,480 in 10 weeks, and Nigeria went from 1 death to 420 in 10 weeks. These are a rapid rise. It's still a small percentage of the 8 million cases worldwide and the 437,000 deaths. But nevertheless, the potential for a steep takeoff is there under these conditions. And that's what we have to look at. Now, what are the conditions? Some of you may be old enough to remember that in 1946, or read about, there was the Hill-Burton Act passed in 1946, a year after the death of President Franklin Roosevelt. And the Hill-Burton Act stipulated that there should be 4.5 hospital beds per 1,000 people. Now think about that, 4.5 beds per 1,000 people. In this current COVID-19 crisis, the United States was a hotspot, and we had 2.9 beds. So we were significantly below what was suggested in 1946. We actually have reduced the number of beds in hospitals in the United States significantly. Italy, another hotspot, has 3.9 beds per 1,000 people. Wuhan, China, had 4.3 beds per 1,000 people, plus they built 10,000 beds overnight practically. Now let's look at sub-Saharan Africa. 25 nations out of 47 in sub-Saharan Africa have less than 1 bed per 1,000 people. 1 bed per 1,000 people. We would need approximately 300 to 500,000 beds, approximately 1 to 2,000 new hospitals with ICU units, ventilators, PPP, etc., to handle the potential crisis, just to meet the Hill-Burton standard of many, many years ago. What else do we have to look at in a health crisis? Physicians. The United States has 2.3 physicians per 1,000 people. And look how many people have passed away in my country. Italy has 4.2 physicians per 1,000 people. And we saw the death rate there. Sub-Saharan Africa averages 0.21 physicians per 1,000 people. Less than essentially 1/5 of a doctor per 1,000 people. And you have in 20 of the sub-Saharan African nations, it is 0.08, less than 1/10 of a doctor per 1,000 people. This cannot be continued. 47 sub-Saharan African nations have a total of 170 medical schools. That's why that's a major problem in graduating and training doctors. 20 of those nations have 1 medical school, and 6 of those nations have no medical schools. That's got to change. We need medical schools, we need virology centers, we need advanced scientific and technological training centers in all areas of science and including in healthcare. If you think about electricity, just to provide electricity for all these hospitals and beds that have to be built, you're talking about 50,000 megawatts. Sub-Saharan Africa has between 100 and 135,000 megawatts currently. So you have to increase it almost 50% just for your hospitals, not even discussing what the population needs. You cannot fight a disease without electricity. What about clean water? You can't fight any disease without clean water. The Africans really have the water and the facilities to wash their hands several times a day. One report is that only 16% of African households have indoor water access that they can go to. These are very serious. You talk about underlying conditions for the COVID-19 for individuals. These are the most serious underlying conditions for Africa, along with disease itself. The number of people with AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis are all underlying conditions. This is why we have to change the situation. This crisis has now brought to our attention the weakness that has existed for, let's say, since the liberation movements of the 60s. We've now had 60 years where we have not corrected what was done by slavery, colonialism, and neo-colonialism. Now is the time that that correction has to be made. Prime Minister Abiy called for canceling debt for the debt service for the next 2 years. He's correct. This has been echoed by other African leaders. Debt is not as important as human life. But we have to go much further than this proposal of canceling debt. We need a new conception of economics. We are not animals. We are not governed by pleasure and pain. We are not governed by the invisible hand. We are human beings, and we are sacred because we have the power. We've been endowed with unique power of creative reason. Creativity is what makes each human being in Africa and everywhere in the world invaluable.
Dr. Freeman, 5 more minutes.
And this is the universal principle that must guide our policies. Franklin Roosevelt, when he initiated the Bretton Woods in 1944, set up the bank, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. He intended that bank to remove the freedom of the desire of want, to remove from the world freedom from want. by developing the world. This was his intention. The Tennessee Valley Authority was the great infrastructure program he intended to export to the world. He had great visions for Africa, including greening the Sahara Desert. This vision died in 1945, April 12th, and a little man, Harry Truman, took over and allied with Winston Churchill to give us the Cold War and maintain colonialism. Now is the time for us to have a new Bretton Woods, to bring a new commitment to science and culture, to develop new ideas and industrialize Africa. My wish for the African youth, I don't think there's too many African youth. I'm not worried about overpopulation. All these young people have creative minds, and their creative minds and souls have to take up the mission to finally industrialize Africa, to bring it up to the level that it should have been over at least a half century ago. To the mission for young people in Africa is to engage in new scientific and technological discoveries that will bring an end to hunger and poverty. And so this COVID-19, even though it's an ugly, deadly crisis, becomes the opportunity for us and friends of Africa and Africans themselves and Africa youth to finally do for the continent what should have been done many decades ago. Thank you.
We applaud you, Dr. Freeman. Thank you for those wise words, and also the dire challenge that you've given to each and every one here, and of course, all governments across the globe, not just in the African continent or within the Northern Hemisphere, but around the world. Let me start off with a question as we're waiting for others to provide their question. You're talking about this as an opportunity to move forward, Dr. Freeman. What do you see that would be, say, the top 3 priorities you're looking at for the continent among all 54 countries? And thank you.
Thank you very much for the question, sir. What is primary, absolutely primary, is infrastructure. There are many silly people who think that Africa can somehow skip over infrastructure. It cannot. We need over 1,000 gigawatts of power for Africa to catch up to the rest of the world. We need east, west, north, south, high-speed railroads. So we have to have infrastructure. We have to have a manufacturing sector, so we don't have to buy products from the rest of the world. It's a matter of national security that you can produce your own necessary products for life. We have to advance the agricultural industry and make it into an agricultural processing industry, so that, again, we're not buying food either from across the continent by thousands of miles or across the world. These are essential components of a productive economy for African nations to provide for their people. Food is a national security question. If you have a hungry population, you have instability and insecurity, as we see most especially in Northeast Nigeria in the Lake Chad Basin, where that area of the world is suffering from the shrinking of a lake, which we could reverse through policies that I and others have advanced and transform that area. That can be water projects, energy projects, rail projects can be initiated across the continent.
Thank you very much for that. Do we have anyone else that would like to ask a question right now? You can either do it here by text, or you can go ahead and ask it verbally.
Yeah, we have the next speaker though.
All right, we still have another 5 minutes for Q&A if you want to take it. Yes, Mary, we got
Yes, we have
people
the next
talking.
speaker though. We have the next speaker. We should mind of time. John Dixon.
Okay.
Huh?
Yes, I understand that, but I'm keeping time from when we started. So do you want to go ahead and have Philip come up next?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Freeman, for being with us. And I know you'll be here throughout the day.
Yes, I will.
And we appreciate your words of wisdom and sharing with us. Our next speaker, let me bring his bio up here. This is Philip Masila Mutisia. Philip, thank you for being with us. Philip has a broad background as far as understanding the needs on the African continent, also how that we must network around the globe in order to solve the many issues and challenges that has been highlighted through COVID-19, but yet is not the start of these issues, and these have been there for many, many years. So if I can call you Philip. Philip, are you ready to begin?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, Sam.
Okay, thank you very much. And we're starting you at 10 sharp. So
Okay.
we'll be 10:20, we'll be wrapping up and then a Q&A. And thank you for being here.
Yes, it's a pleasure to join this platform of esteemed speakers, and presentation is topics very timely. As you can see, if you read my bio, I'm a professor of education, and I've been, of course, educated in Kenya and here in the US, over 30 some years. And also partnering with the different organizations like Global Peace Foundation and other Kenyan diaspora organizations and African diaspora organizations in a search of mitigating the solutions, the problems faced by the development. And my background is also in international development. So I tend to look for solutions. As Dr. Freeman Lawrence shared, he shared statistics and the problems, which is indicative of what the pandemic has shown. A pandemic has shown for us in higher education, and I'm going to speak from education perspective, because education is the mother and father of all anything else: development, environmental safety, collaboration, participation, and also how do you empower people, and how do you share the information. I want to reduce temperature of hysteria, or I want to ask us to start a communication from different perspectives from the way we have been doing. When you look at the research in higher education as a whole, K-20, it focuses on pathology, what you do not know, but we rarely focus on what we do know. When you talk about the numbers, statistics, now the projection of how we are going to suffer, the pandemic has been caused by hysteria, miscommunication, and disinformation and misinformation. And because who we are not communicating, it showed us how paralyzed we were. Even we are still paralyzed. For example, when I talk about we talk about democracy and the stable communities, we have been talking about those deficits as opposed to what people have, and then empower them by engaging them to create infrastructure. For example, you talked about water, clean water, and clean energy. All that clean water is available, and its energy is valuable, but it's an explode because whoever trains, educates, try to build infrastructures are now built to benefit the local people, or the indigenous people, or the people who need it. It's to benefit a few who go in there and say, okay, we are putting this money to develop you. But the majority of money is spent at the district level where the money came from, as opposed to where it needs to be. So there is a kind of, I want us to engage differently in how we communicate in a more dialogue, not to communicate. 15 minutes, you can do nothing but just point out, which is I'm gonna do, for example. I just wanna point out our conversation should shift from debates, discussions, to a dialogue, whereby if I'm done with the dialogue, I take appropriate action, which will go to a solution, not to be dictated by the the hysteria of misinformation or what I should be coming. What has caused the pandemic? If it actually, Corona did not it caused it, but it opened the pandemic. The pandemic of the institutionalized, discriminatory, predatory approach into the way we communicate and the way we do business, the way we develop economy. It's not benefiting the people who produce economy. And so I propose we change the direction of our conversation towards solutions and then bring it on the table at equal level from diaspora, which is what has drained Africa of intellect as well as the ability to benefit themselves by depending on the Western way. And so now we are looking at East. But we have abundance of environmental wealth, which we have not been able to teach the youth and the people to benefit from. We have created a dependency on even the mindset. There's no growth mindset from, the Africa, for example, is projected to be the center of the world economy in the next 30, 40 years. But that information comes like, oh no, it's no way that can happen because I don't know what's happening on the ground. When you look at the statistics, where they presented from the media, not from the real people, the people are not communicating what their solutions are, the needs of solutions. So the education for this, for example, look at the African higher education, even from K-12. There's no manufacturing of any kind, no infrastructure. They depend on the government. You don't depend on government without putting money in the government. Government does not make money. It makes money from the private sector and also the people producing. So I want us to be careful of projecting fear by just defining all problem. And then start talking about asking the right question. Okay, how are we thinking about environmental sustainability from my individual self to the community, to local, national, international, and global, because we have no choice today. Infrastructure capacity building. What is it we need to do, which you are capable of doing, not what you are not capable of, because that's what we talk about. Manufacturing, clean water. The majority of, even Corona does not kill as many people like they're killed every day by poverty and dirty water, waterborne diseases. All you're doing, we have technology already developed whereby you can desalinate, filter, and also clean the water, also clean energy so it does not pollute. A good example is how many people have died from Corona since the death in the West. That's another angle I want to, from educational side, I want to caution us by throwing numbers and then they don't add to the environmental test. So reflection and action, and that's what I want to call it. So partnership and a collaboration towards empowerment as a new normal. We are not going to think to do the same way we have been doing. To think, if we need to teach the person washing hands, if there's no clean water, how you wash hands and avoid other diseases. So let's look at how we are messaging, how we are promoting, how we are communicating, how interrogating ourselves, not they, not them. Is what are you suggesting? Can you accept it to be applied to you and to your children? This is where education and international and globalization have failed to look at, because most of the time we end up debating. We have media and the politicians discussing this, but in the school, in the academy, we lost. We let it. Africa has not started yet, but here, even here, we have hysteria since Corona. We have had African professors. I communicate with them. We're trying to write grants to them for the first time, but they did not even have the idea how to engage to solve to get some funding to solve the local problems. And that's where, because it's not their job to look for funding to create manufacturing, to create industry, to improve economy, to improve the health. Just information, health information is critical. So we need to start looking at how to collaborate for real. Collaboration means working together, not me depending to you and depend on me. I want to just call upon the, I'm going to cut what I was going to say because to go clear, so I can paint the picture in a normal way. A study on modernizing learning, modernizing learning, such that the landscape of learning has broadened. It has broadened, now encompassing the full spectrum of formal, informal, and experiential training, education, and the development. The traditional concept of education is changing. Employers are placing less value on formal degrees instead of experiences. Experience matters. Life skills such as grit and teamwork matter today more than ever before. Performance-based credentials, not just a certificate, including competency badges and micro certificates, are taking place are replacing transcripts to document individual traits, talent, skills, and acknowledgement of preferences and what have you. The study further suggests that similarly, age is becoming less of a marker of knowledge, skill, and capabilities. These shifts, in turn, are disrupting conventional career trajectories as age correlates less and less with income and the leadership potentials, and even changing the way we perceive employment and define our value as contributors to society. We use phrases like future learning, modernizing, assessment, and so on and so forth. So I propose we get away from the traditional way of doing things, because that we've been doing that, but we're not getting anywhere. And the pandemic, as a hysteria, I call it, has opened the door to realize how paralyzed we are, how disconnected we are. So education, we need to think from education from dependency to independence, interdependence rather, and focus on health. Health is your first wealth. You need to educate the young people to know that. Entrepreneurship mindset has to be the cornerstone of the messaging, because everybody is naturally entrepreneur, especially Africans. I know I grew up where I didn't even know, I didn't see a car, I didn't go to hospital until I was 18 years. I'm here, I'm healthy, almost 70 years, I don't pop pills, because I was taught to learn about who I am and also how to mind my environment to enhance sustain my life. I was taught to be a productive person, not to be sitting down and waiting for someone to employ me. Infrastructure, communication is the number one. Like, for example, this Zoom is the only tool which has been able to connect people. Others not there, but you find this engaging youth young people can produce this in better communication technology. If you look at the connectivity in schools, government, they're all parallels. University close. Here, I did not close. I taught it's normal, because it's use Zoom and the online, the same way we usually do. So infrastructure and the capacity to connect, and also focus on environmental sustainability. We are wasting a lot of land, a lot of energy, a lot of resources from disasters, which happen every year. But we don't pay attention to that because we are trying to look for the best out there, where it's not here. Creativity is not encouraged in terms of, even in agriculture, when you're microfinancing, microeconomics, that's what you need to look at, to say, okay, the papa, we mamboga, the person who sells the greens, apples, and all that, that person, if we focus on helping them to create a capacity to produce and preserve and to also to feed themselves first before they even go sell, it will help. Clean energy. We have already an organization here we have formed together which call, for us, we are creating a university in Kenya with the Kenyan professors here who work here in institutions here. We are creating Diaspora University. It's going to be, we partner with the WPI. Those are solution things. I don't see Nigeria or Africa, other places in Africa partnering with the institutions here. We work here, but we do not invest to put back what we drain the brains from Africa. Now Diaspora is calling for the brain gate. And you don't have to be there to do that. So for example, look at the panel here. And also, I wanted to point out that we created a Diaspora University, which is going to be the one of the kind in the world, whereby it produces producers of knowledge economy, creators of jobs, not to depend on the government, but it's using ourselves. And so is any other, I know there are other people scheduled to speak. We have an African Diaspora Coalition. There's so many diaspora organizations in Europe and here and in Asia of African people of African descent, but we have not been communicated. The last link I want to link to what really led to the pandemic is also the racism, systemic racism. We need to name it. Don't hide it from statistics or because someone died here. It's been thousands of years. We'll look at Jewish oppression, women oppression, Black oppression, white oppression. But we need to own that. And we need to speak to the power, not to just be throwing it, the statistics just threatening and we don't give some.
2 more minutes, sir.
Okay, leveraging diaspora through partnership in the collaboration as a brain gain is a proposal. I'm engaging Kenyans and other Africans here as our counterpart, and to partnering with Global Peace. It has shown that without diaspora coalition and collaboration and partnership, there will be no peace. Because majority of what grips the world is conflict. So how can you tell me to be happy and go to work and then I'm not safe? I don't feel safe with my neighbor. I remember a colleague of mine, a Nigerian guy who was wealthy. He said, I can't go to Nigeria because I have to have bodyguard, and even bodyguard, they get blown up. But now, where do we go? Those are questions I want to say. My kids, I have 4 kids, married to African American, but I see very little, and I work in a historically Black institution. We have the first Nigerian born chancellor, but you could see the big the hate, the resistance of embracing.
Philip, 1 more minute, please, sir.
So yeah, so I wanted to say that we need to have a new normal. Dialogue is a key, and from dialogue to trialogue. Trialogue is looking after triple heritage, and it's start looking our problems, how they, white people, Black people, yellow people, we are affected by the same thing, the disconnect of information and the lack of collaboration and partnership. And I'll leave that for the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very insightful presentation. Also tying all the ends together that was established for us with Dr. Freeman. And Dr. Freeman, thank you for teeing up the entire group. We have a number of questions for you, Philip, if I can continue to use your first name. It's about education. How do we, yes.
We have the last speaker, and then we'll get to the floor for questions, remember? We have Dr. Abdul online.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll wait, but I'll start hard at 11 myself, but I'll wait.
Mary, what are you saying?
We have Dr. Abdul as the next speaker in the sequence, and then we'll
I understand,
go to
but we're giving each one of them 20 minutes and 5 minutes for Q&A.
Yeah,
do
the
you
5
want to
minutes.
skip over the Q&A?
No, the 5 minutes were to come after the end of the panel.
Oh,
Yeah.
No, that's okay. That's not how it was set up in the agenda. So is that how you want to do it?
Yeah, because we don't want to overlap on the presentation and then we end up not hearing from the other important part.
Well, we're going to have everybody speak, but okay, we'll do it. You're the queen of the day, so we'll do whatever you like. Okay, the next speaker is going to be John Dixon. John, thank you for. Mary, are you chiming in again?
Yeah. No, that's okay.
Okay, all right. I heard your voice, so I always say yes, ma'am, to the queen.
No.
Anyway, John, thank you for being with us today. Thank you for sharing the ideas and the insights that you have as far as what's going on, not just in the world, but also specifically on the African continent. So, John, if you'll go ahead and start with your presentation to the group that's here. And thank you for sharing. John?
Yeah, thank you, Sam. I just got shut off. Was that just me? I might have an unstable connection today. I'm not sure.
You're here loud and clear, and thank you. We can see you very well.
All right, great. Well, it's really an honor to be here. I wasn't that familiar with Watch Democracy Grow before, but I've been very excited to as I've looked at it and what the project's been doing. Very grateful to Mary and Dr. Udofia for inviting me to participate and be part of this. During this COVID time, I've been home longer than I've ever been probably in the last 40 years, I think for a 3-month stretch. And so I planted a garden and I'm watching my garden grow. But in between watching the garden grow, I'm out there watering and hoeing and weeding, and it's really been a lot of work. So this democracy development and encouraging and strengthening democratic institutions in Africa is a tough challenge, but one that is the most rewarding probably that we can be a part of. I'm the one person without a PhD on the program today, so I'm going to take the liberty to speak from a little different perspective. My background is all over the place. Sam, do you remember meeting me? We've met a few times in the past.
Yes, absolutely. This is through the World Trade Centers.
That was
and I hope everyone actually looks at your bio, because you have a very rich focus on business, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Sam. Also, we have a common friend, John Danner, who's now on the other side.
Absolutely.
But
John is an outstanding humanitarian, and unfortunately, he passed about 3 years ago. So.
Yes, a Choctaw Indian that I did a lot of work in the Native American community with. That
Correct.
relates and has helped me understand Africa quite some degree. But one thing I learned working with the Native American communities, every tribe has a very different culture and different language, but there's a kind of a universal expression there that almost all the elders would tell me is the journey from here to here, from here to here is the longest journey. And down here is the place we're all connected, and up here is where we're all different from each other. So I really appreciate Dr. Mutizia's perspective, and I think he's really trying to bring education down here when most of it works with young people to get them all up here. Also, I've been to Africa several times, but to be honest, I've been there for conferences. So I'm at hotels, nice hotels, and talking with smart people, and but I've not been in the villages. I did have one experience in Cairo about 40 years ago that was a little different. But so we were talking about the people of Africa from the hotel, a very convenient and comfortable place, but we weren't really connecting with the people of Africa. And so my experience with the people of Africa is mostly here through the diaspora community that Dr. Phillip had mentioned. I was in the Pacific Northwest with the the Immigrant and Refugee Consortium of the Pacific Northwest. For about 10 years, I was on the board. The president there was Dr. Dapo Sabomihin, a Yoruba from Nigeria. And I learned, I had just a fantastic experience working there. Coming to the East Coast, Washington, D.C., I continued to work with the various diaspora communities. I find that these immigrant communities can really help remind America what this country was all about. Sam, your last name's Hancock. My middle name is Hancock. So, and my father's name was John Hancock. My grandmother was Hancock. And so this Declaration of Independence is very important to me. And I think it was a document that it didn't say all Americans were created equal, but all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with inalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And the purpose of government was to protect those rights. That was a revolutionary document that we're still trying to see manifest
It's
today.
still revolutionary.
Still revolutionary, but it still holds the key there. I think it's a very important key. And before I forget, I will forget this if I don't mention it. I'm also on the steering committee of the Alliance of NGOs and CSOs for South cooperation at the United States. In an NGO, I'd really, please get in touch with me. I would encourage you, I would love for you to be a part of it. It's a good way to give input to the UN that's not often, it gets outside of the bubble. It's a real black hole there on the east side of Manhattan, and it needs to be connected to the communities, just like people dealing with Africa need to be in the villages. So the UN needs input from around the world. So please get in touch with me later if you'd be interested in that. The theme here is prioritizing social infrastructure development in Africa. So in the post-COVID time, I believe that the core infrastructure, social infrastructure is the family. And I think in this regard, Africa is way ahead of the United States. It's another place we've gotten lost. But when I was in the Northwest and talking to my Africa friends, they would say, "Oh, my uncle does this," or "My brother is doing this," and then I would meet that person, and they'd have a different last name, and it turns out most of them weren't even have any real relations to that person, but they were all the cousin or uncle or brother or sister. It was fascinating. And this is actually a key to the power of for Africa's development and future. That social infrastructure is you can't duplicate and you can't force that. And that should be encouraged and worked with as the core infrastructure. So governments shouldn't be working with individuals. They should honor the sovereignty of the family and work with families in Africa and encourage families as a model of a model of governance and sovereignty, and as the school of love. Really, that's where people learn. Families where we learn to love one another and to be responsible for each other. And that I really respect and love so much from my experience in the diaspora communities in the United States. As Sam mentioned, my background is all over the place. I started I had an architecture degree, then I studied world religions, and then I got another degree in human relations. So I had really not been on quite a career track. And none of those degrees or studies related to business. I think I had maybe one course on business or development in all those three courses that I took. So I had no background in business, but I found myself, I was in Okinawa through my working with a cross-cultural communication center. And then I became the vice president of the American University Extension in Okinawa. And we were doing international training for the young people. And Okinawa is very far south province of prefecture of Japan. And it's very unique culture. Again, it's very different people. And they had larger families, and families were very passionate and important there. But there were no international jobs in Okinawa for young people that got training in that area. Even though there were many military bases that people could work at Burger King or McDonald's on the base, but there wasn't anything going on. And Okinawa had been an independent trading kingdom for centuries. So that's how I bumped into this idea of, I felt that if we created a World Trade Center in Okinawa, that we could bring back that original heritage of trade and commerce to the people directly. And so I got involved in that, and we made that project happen. And through that, I learned the value of the business community. Later, I was in Okinawa when 9/11 happened, and I felt I really was struggling at that time because the Twin Towers was the headquarters of the Association of the World Trade Centers, which started in 1970. And I couldn't find out what was going on back there or what had happened to my friends, the president of the association, or any of the executive team working there, the people that I knew. And at the same time, that week, I was teaching a seminar to the Japanese military officers. And they were like, what are you going to do? How's America going to retaliate? And I would just, and the big monitors in the room, in our conference room, just showing that all day long, the Twin Towers. And so I would just have to go out in the hall and cry. I had no idea I never felt so helpless. And finally, I got an inspiration, which is to start a World Trade Center in Afghanistan, because isolation is what made the country dangerous and unstable. So through doing that, I became the chair of the Committee on Peace Through Trade for the World Trade Centers Association. And because of that, I was invited to chair a conference of the World Association of NGOs. And this was not long after the Enron implosion came up. So we're at this conference of NGOs, and my session was at the very end. I was to introduce, chairing this committee that had the number 3 guy, Zia Rizvi from the United Nations, was going to be the keynote speaker there, with a panel of 3 or 4 others. And all for 3 days, I just heard everybody talking about Enron. And finally, when we got up to open our session, I put my notes aside. I said, I've been very surprised. This is an NGO conference, yet everybody's talking about Enron. Everybody here is kind of seems to be business background or something. So I want you to tell me, what was the malfeasance at Enron? Which agency discovered the problem there, the malfeasance there? And everybody raised their hand. They're pretty sharp. FBI or CIA or SEC, and went down, and I explained to them, no, actually it was the bank. And at a certain point, you can play games with your books, but if you don't have money to pay your bills, you break. So I told them, you don't have to worry about business so much. You guys can write any report you want and send it in, but business people have to actually make the bills. So, and I told them also that every penny that this NGO has to spend, or that a government has to spend, is generated by a businessman. So I don't know why you should hate business, because, so I told them, I want you to repeat after me, business is my friend. And of course, it was very quiet in there. And I said, I'm chairing this session and we're not moving on. You're not going to get to hear Dr. Rizvi.
John, 5 more minutes, sir.
Thank you. And so it's not that hard. Just let's hear you. I think you can say those words. Business is my friend. So finally, they all did. We had a big laugh. It was very warm, exciting. Then I introduced Dr. Rizvi, and he immediately said, I want everybody in this room to know that I did not repeat after Mr. Dixon, business is my friend, because we all know businesses are corrupt and selfish, greedy, and that are like that. So, but after the session, after we finished all the panel, there were 2 panelists from Africa, and one of them was in tears, actually. He said, I never imagined, we only think government and NGOs have the answer for us. And we couldn't imagine what you're talking about today. And so I just want to encourage, again, my background is all over the place. So I believe in radical collaboration. I think the problems today are very complicated and can't be solved by just the experts in the one discipline. I have no discipline. So I've seen the magic happens between the disciplines and with input from all the sectors. The problems in Africa need to be solved by the African people, and it has to be cross-sectoral and way out of the box. But it has to be based on the absolute social infrastructure of the family, and respect for the family, and respect for human rights, respect for the dignity of every human being. So anyhow, yeah, it's collaboration and partnerships are the way forward. This is a real and I think Dr. Oyabani was getting to that point also in his presentation. The old models haven't worked. There's been so much money thrown at the continent, but that didn't touch the people. Democracy is really a bottom-up process, and I think the development needs to work that way also. It just doesn't have lasting power and power to change if it's just the experts and the nice hotels deciding for everybody. So I'm with Dr. Philip here to let's engage education. By the way, after COVID, I'm wearing shorts and no shoes right now. I couldn't do that if I was at a conference.
John, 2 more minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
This conference costs nothing. Everybody here is traveled around. We're all together, and it's free. It's unbelievable what COVID has opened up with technology. As far as education goes, I have 5 kids, 2 girls, 3 boys. The 2 girls make about 3 times what their 3 brothers make. So in America, the gender gap has really been closing anyhow. And my youngest son says he decided not to go to college because he said, Dad, I can learn everything I need to know on YouTube. Why should I go? And actually MIT, Harvard, they all have courses that are accessible. So as long as we can get cell phones in the hands of all the young people in Africa, and many have them, they have access to the best education in the world without having to fly there, and they don't have to put on shoes like I'm not wearing.
Good.
So, and it's
John, 1 last minute.
Well, anyhow, that's the electrification is the same thing. It's being democratized now as the technology develops. There's a lot of ways to break it down. It doesn't have to be the old-fashioned power grid, but all of it's important. Clean water is critical, and that's the hardest one, I think, to solve. But there's some fantastic new technology with osmosis and diaphragms and gravity-driven systems. As long as people are the owners, the ownership has to go down to the local level. And again, very grateful to be here, and look forward to long-term engagement with Watch Democracy Grow. Thank you.
John, thank you very much for those words. Also, thank you about the mantra is business is your friend. Even though I have, PhD and all that, I still came up through the business background, as you know, and we shared with each other there at the World Trade Centers in New York. And I remember those days very fondly, and have been visiting a lot of actually your facilities in India, China, and other places. So
Yeah,
you're
great.
doing very good work. We have the next speaker, and Mary, I assume you don't want to have a 5-minute Q&A now, so we're going to keep moving on with our agenda. Is that correct? Mary, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Okay, you want
Okay.
us to proceed on with the next speaker, and we'll do the questions at the end, correct?
Yeah, the model is going to be speakers first, then after the speakers, last the 5 questions for Q&A for the last for everybody.
Okay, all right.
All right,
I've got,
thank you.
I have enough questions to do us for about the next 3 days, so.
Also, we have changes that I just sent you for the next group that will be coming. Please check. Thank you so much.
Okay, I will do so.
Mhm.
Okay, we have Dr. Abdullah, and he is a medical doctor, so quite different than the educators, the businessman. And now we're going to hear from the medical profession. And you have his very extensive bio in front of you. And thank you for being here, sir, and welcome. Abdullah,
Abdul?
are you here? Is he here?
It should be. Dr. Abdul? Dr. Abdul? It should be. He was. Jack, do you see Dr. Abdul?
Yeah, he's available right now.
And he should be unmuted.
Okay, Mary, if you can check and.
Maybe you can be actually answering the questions. Let me check on that.
Okay, I will go ahead and ask the questions and let you do that. I'm going to go back up through the chain if that's okay. John, looking at the World Trade Centers and your work around the globe, these are truly needed in the 54 nations of the African continent. How do we spread the wealth as far as the World Trade Centers, which really is a magnet for bringing together manufacturing, services, and education all together in one facility? And be quick, and then I'm going to Philip.
Well, yeah, thanks, Sam. There are several trade centers in 2 in Nigeria, and Ghana has one in Accra. And the next year's General Assembly 2021 will be at the Accra World Trade Center, which is very exciting. The trade centers are a wonderful platform for empowering SMEs. The big multinational corporations don't need a World Trade Center, but it really helps the small companies, empowers them, and it links them to one another so that the information you're getting is direct and qualified, because the folks in the World Trade Center don't want to hurt their own reputation to recommend a person who doesn't have integrity. They also provide great training, and as a destination for interns, it's fantastic real world experience. And so I've been recently in Georgetown, Guyana. We're looking at one, and I'm talking to a few other folks on the continent as well. So thank you for bringing that up. It is a useful tool. It's only a tool, but it's a useful one.
Well,
for,
and also
development.
it has a massive footprint across the globe.
It does.
That's why I was asking about, we need to have more on the African continent.
Absolutely, it's
Sure.
it's the largest missing there. And you said India and China, they each have India has about 40 now, I think, and China
Right.
about 50. US has 50, I think.
Right.
The Reagan Building in Washington, D.C.'s World Trade Center, Washington.
I know that.
Yeah.
And actually, before COVID, I was there almost every day.
Were you?
Because there's so many different organizations.
Oh,
But John,
yeah.
thank you for being
Sure.
here.
Yeah, thank you.
Philip,
Steve.
looking at the diaspora, you've mentioned that numerous times. The diaspora is everywhere across American society. It's everywhere across the world. how do we harness that so that is a positive energy and engine for change, but it's a positive engine and dynamic for change and not just trying to bring change for change's sake?
Excellent question. And I just answered some of that in the chat as well.
Lawrence, you're up next.
What I've discovered is that engaging ourselves here and partnering with our counterparts, so to speak, because I'm a citizen here as you are, in the American, or whether you are, if you're Europe diaspora citizen, we have never had a dialogue on how do we leverage our capacity. Remittances are sent home, they go to a waste because they are not organized, no channel to go and to preserve and elevate and accelerate economy. It just goes consumer. It's the same here. We have a lot of, like, for example, the minority groups, which I don't like to call minority, or people of color, basically, they produce the most wealth because they're the ones who produce economy. We pay taxes. We do not see how that tax also empowers us here locally here in diaspora, and also where we come from, because when I left to Kenya, I left a deficit. And that deficit should not be just drained from you, overseas. It should be collaborating and partnering with my cousin, man, like you, John Dixon, you named it.
Right.
Yes. Africans are naturally and most entrepreneurial people ever, because they can make something out of nothing. And we have been, all we have to do is partner here. And our African Americans, brothers and sisters who came here a little bit earlier, we have a disconnect, which is also, the disconnect is institutionalized by the policies, which are set to disengage us as opposed to, so we become dependent. And also dependency give you a fish all the time, as opposed to teaching me how to do the fish. So I challenge my diaspora partners here, white, black, whoever has interest of Africa. The next center of the economy of the world is going to be Africa. Here, resources are dwindling. Europe, Asia, even infertility, and all those kinds of things. We don't look at the environment and see how we can use the environment to save other places. Yeah, we have drained Africa, but we are luckily enough, we have not been able to exploit all of it. Now, all we need to do is to preserve by investing back there, and of course, will be reciprocal now. When I talk about collaboration and partnership, I'm not talking about just going to give. No, I'm talking about, okay, what are you doing over there? Would you feed me here? The trade is also another barrier because of policies, international relationships. I remember the policies here that barring Nigerians from coming here, and your families in Africa. That is because we have not been able to participate in a civic engagement in this country, and also to have an equitable way of looking and engaging with each other. Yet,
okay.
What are we building with? And then not just focus on what we don't have.
Philip, thank you very much for sharing that. Lawrence, if I can go to you, looking at your 30 years, you have many best practices that you actually mentioned during your 20-minute presentation to us. What would be 3 of the main things, and this is one of the questions we have, that would actually help to propel forward, building on what Philip was saying, and also John with his World Trade Centers? What 3 best practices could you share with our group right here that we should be focused on at this time to raise the image, raise the dynamics of the African economy, so it's actually helping the people you're talking about that have an income, they have health care, education, and also something to eat?
If we look to the future, we know that approximately by 2050, the population on the continent may increase to 2.4 billion people, and maybe 1.1 billion will be young people. therefore, we have to always think about the future when we're governing our practices of today. It's called time reversal. And therefore, unless we provide meaningful, productive jobs and meaningful life for these young people, they're going to be enemies, quote, of progress because they're going to be very rebellious. I've traveled all over the sections of Sudan and Nigeria with people, stayed with people who live not the way they should live. So therefore, how do we create productive, meaningful jobs that give a productive, meaningful life? There's a famous expression I got from Nigeria on my first trip there in the 90s. The poor people don't sleep because they're poor and don't have food and air conditioning. And the rich people don't sleep because the poor people don't sleep because they're afraid of what's going to happen to their wealth. So productive jobs means we have to make investments now. The question of infrastructure has to involve governments, public sector investment, like we did in the United States under Franklin Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln, and John Quincy Adams and George Washington. The government plays a role in public sector involvement in crucial areas of infrastructure that employ people, increase the profitability of the economy. We have to have inputs into the economy that raise the productive level of the workforce in terms of their output and profitability. So therefore, we have to look at energy. We have to look at rail. Water is a crucial element of this. Healthcare is an absolutely essential human right. The human rights group should raise a healthcare issue as a fundamental human right, because if you don't have healthcare, people don't live. If you don't have food, they don't live. So these are, I think, governments involving themselves. The African program, the 2063 agenda, has a very far-reaching vision for African development. My vision is a little bit further than theirs, but it's pretty good in terms of what the continent has to do. The Africa Free Trade Agreement now gives us a new potential for countries to work together and develop. And I see the future could be very prosperous, but we have to involve ourselves in the right set of policies today to guarantee the best possible future for the generations to come.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. Mary, do we have our last speaker yet? Oh, there he is.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, I see him. Yes, Dr. Abidali, you have been introduced, and I told people to look at your extensive resume and bio, and you're the medical doctor and specialist among this group, and thank you for being here.
Hello?
Are you with us?
I can see him.
Yeah,
though.
yes.
There he is.
Hello?
Welcome,
Okay.
sir. Welcome to the group. Glad to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here. Sorry for the late. Very bad connection. I'm having a connection problem.
Well, we're glad to have you here. You're the medical professional among this entire body. And so we're very excited to have you here and to hear about how we need to look at healthcare as a driver for even economic and environmental development and best practices. And we have many questions about the medical conditions on the continent. So please share with us, sir. And you have 20 minutes and I will be timing.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, you and the team. Regarding the healthcare system in Africa, the whole continent, if we look back on our history, on 27th April 2001, the African governments made a historic pledge to allocate at least 15% of their annual budget to the health sector. That pledge was known as Abuja Declaration. That was 2001, 27th April. So that meeting was to strengthen Africa's health systems and prepare for kinds of pandemic, like the pandemic now we are having in the whole world, COVID-19. So in 2020, COVID-19 pandemic exposed the hidden or concealed tragedy, as coronavirus revealed the acute shortage of critical and life-saving equipments, such as ventilator and intensive care beds in African countries. For example, World Health Organization, WHO, reported by mid-April 2020, there were only 2,000 ventilators across 41 African countries. Only 2,000 ventilators for 41 African countries. Only 5,000 intensive care beds across 43. 10 countries did not have any ventilators at all. In addition, Africa has a limited number of medical personnel trained to operate than that was available. So at the beginning of the this pandemic in this year, WHO has warned that Africa could be next epicenter of coronavirus outbreak. To this date, Africa, if we look dates and numbers, Africa's first COVID case-19 was reported in Egypt on 14th February. Since then, a total of 52 countries have reported cases in Africa. First COVID-19 case in sub-Saharan Africa was recorded in Nigeria on 25th February. According to Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention, Africa CDC, on 14th June, that was when I was preparing for this presentation, the cases in the continent has passed 233,732, while the death number was 6,253, while recoveries were at 106,999 patients. Although official counts of COVID-19 infection and deaths reflect only minor, fraction of the virus toll in Africa. So the numbers maybe are more than that is said by the governments. So the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention was established recently. Specifically, it was established in 2017. The center stitched together coordinated strategy through video conferences with heads of state, and leaders were quick to take scientific advice on frontier closures or border closures and screening or lockdowns. So with countries having small window of early warning, countries had little choice but to act early. That was a positive step which Africa did, acting early. So many countries started closing their borders early, and many countries in Africa started screening in airports and borders early in the pandemic. And also, we have to remember that Africa's experience in handling viral outbreaks like Ebola also provided knowledge on how to react to pandemics. So regarding healthcare system in Somalia, for example, where I have first-hand information, Somalia has been embroiled in war for 3 decades. At least estimated people of 2.6 million people are currently displaced within the country. The healthcare system and infrastructure in Somalia remains weak and is poorly resourced, inadequately distributed. Mainly, it's located in the capital city and 2 other major cities. And major public hospitals and public health infrastructure are destroyed or were destroyed in the civil war. So also a problem that Africa and specifically my country have is health expenditure. Expending on health and training health workers remains very low. And there is also a critical shortage of PPE, personal protective equipment for frontline health workers, especially in the early days of the pandemic. So according to US-based think tank RAND Infectious Disease Vulnerability Index published in February, Somalia was ranked 194 out of 195 countries in the Johns Hopkins Global Health Security Index for 2019, as Somalia is the worst prepared country to deal with pandemic. That's because of poor investment of healthcare system and healthcare infrastructure, with overall infrastructure in Somalia and all Africa. So in Somalia, there's only one dedicated hospital for COVID-19, only one hospital for 15 million people, Somalia. So in that case, you can understand that maybe Somalia is bracing for a catastrophic outbreak. And in the early days of the pandemic, 70% of the daily testing were coming back positive in the early days. And Somalia confirmed its first case in Mogadishu, 16 March, as 13th of June. There were 2,579 confirmed cases with 87 cases. But official counts of COVID-19 and deaths and infections reflect only a fraction of the virus toll. So many steps that are developed countries are taking to prevent the spread of COVID-19 or coronavirus in the population are not being able to be to work in Somalia or in Africa. For example, facial masks or face masks and working from home are not possibilities for the majority of Somali population and many people in Africa. People need to put food on their table, and they work on their daily. They eat what they earn from their work, which they do per day. So government is not equipped to provide stimulus checks in Africa or in Somalia. So majority of the people whose daily income is average of $2 have no choice but to venture out for work, to put food on their table. So unfortunately, African countries is not an option for social distancing. So if we look back, spotlight on poor state of public health systems in Africa, their shortage of medical capacity has put spotlight on the poor state of public health systems in Africa and the distance yet to be traveled to ensure that healthcare is affordable and accessible to all persons. A recent report by Mo Ibrahim Foundation shows that only 10 African countries provide free and universal healthcare. Only 10 countries. An Afrobarometer report found that even before COVID-19, more than half of all the people in the continent could not access necessary medical care, at least once a year. They couldn't access. So most people's experience accessing public health facilities include waiting in long queues, often never getting the care they seek, or having to use bribes to get the attention or the medical attention that they need. So at the heart of Africa's fragile health systems is the perennial failure of governments to prioritize health and allocate adequate resources for the development of the health infrastructure. The right to health includes ensuring availability of the medical care populations and patients' need, accessibility, acceptability, and quality of health care goods and facilities and services. So COVID-19 pandemic must jolt African countries and governments to adequately invest in the healthcare systems, honor their own constitutions and international human rights treaties that they have ratified, and guarantee the right to health for the citizens. If we compare in this crisis, in the current crisis of COVID-19 pandemic, a large number of OECD countries have increased training. They have rehired retired health professionals. They have placed medical students in the front line and redistributed health workers across their countries. These options are not available for most African countries on the average. World Health Organization calculates that the African region has only 1.4 health workers per 1,000 people. Let me repeat that. WHO calculates that African region has 1.4 health workers per 1,000 people versus, or compared to OECD countries, 12.3 per 1,000 patients or 1,000 people. So you can compare the huge difference. According to WHO, Africa needs 63% more health workers to meet the satisfying or to meet the staffing requirements of universal health coverage. Building up a reserve workforce for pandemic response is an even more remote target. Shortage of health workers also present huge dilemma in the pandemic. Shifting medical staff to COVID-19 care exacerbates shortages in other areas, which might have consequences that suppress those of COVID-19. For example, if we look back in Ebola hit countries, there was an important reduction in maternal and child health services during the response. So, as I mentioned earlier, in 2001, African countries had pledged that they will spend 15% of their annual budget on healthcare, on the health services or healthcare. So, what happened to the Abuja Declaration? The Abuja Declaration in 2001, 2011, 10 years after declaration, 27 countries had increased the proportion of their expenditure allocated to health. However, only 2 countries, Rwanda and South Africa, have reached the 15% target. 7 had actually reduced their health budgets as a proportion of their national budgets. By 2016, the situation have deteriorated. 19 countries were spending less on health as percentage of their public spending than in early 2000. So by 2016, expenditure on health was deteriorating. It's not improving. So the Abuja Declaration is a significant political commitment that supports African countries' obligations to fulfill the right to health. COVID-19 must mark a turning point for health financing and health services on the continent and the investment on and development on health infrastructure. So if we look back in infrastructure development in Africa, infrastructure development is a key driver for progress across the African countries or across the African continent. It's also a critical enabler for productivity and sustainable economical growth. It contributes significantly to human development, poverty reduction, attainment of the Millennium Development Goals. Investment in infrastructure accounts for over half of the recent improvement in economic growth in Africa and has the potential to achieve even more. For Africa, the need for adequate infrastructure, secure energy, efficient transport, reliable communications, resilient sanitation, and affordable housing is particularly apparent, and it will contribute to health and well-being of the citizens. Africa's vast infrastructure deficit is a constraint on its growth, but also opportunity to leapfrog to new, more efficient technologies if the right investment and the right decisions are made. As Africa becomes urbanized, public goods will become easier and cheaper to deliver to a more geographically concentrated populations. Also, another constraint for Africa health infrastructure development is debt. So according to IMF in 2000 report, I quote, debt relief as indicated previously, expenditure on health and other, one constraint identified is continued spending on debt sectors. Debt relief as indicated previously, expenditure on health and other social sectors in many African countries, including some of those reviewed in the present report, has been constrained by their heavy debt burden. A key objective of reducing the debt burden is to free up resources for priority services, including health, education, and rural development. IMF 2000. So in conclusion, with all darkness painted, there is also a hope and light at the end of the tunnel for Africa. In this pandemic, Africa's young entrepreneurs and innovators against all odds are coming up with revolutionary ideas to tackle the pandemic. They are locally producing ventilators, face masks, hand sanitizers, solar-powered oxygens. Many countries, from Senegal to Somalia to Kenya, Zimbabwe, Liberia, young innovators and entrepreneurs with locally available resources. They are against all odds producing what's needed critically for the survival of their populations. So African leaders should fulfill the promise of Abuja Declaration by increasing on the healthcare system, as many countries like my country are spending less than 9% of their annual budget on healthcare system. Also, issues such as trade imbalances. African countries often purchase medicine and medical equipment on international markets. Okay, thank you. So loss of health workers through migration is also a constraint. Capital flight, corruption are all constraints, and health provision in the poorest countries. These challenges are interlinked and should be addressed by global governance mechanism. And as shown in this pandemic of great magnitude in our modern period, Africa and the world should further promote solidarity that they possess. International organizations and world donors of the continent and partners of the continent should focus on creating durable and sustainable healthcare solutions in the continent instead of being at response position to pandemics and outbreaks. Debt relief should be initiated also. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here, and very critical information that you had to share. Some of it sobering, but at the same time, some is much helpful. So looking at the youth, this is something that really came out in your message, is that people are coming up with solutions. And even though you may have local resources, they have a way to deal with these issues. Give us 2 or 3 ideas about how they're actually addressing this in a positive manner, using local conditions, local materials, and local ingenuity. And again, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Samuel, for having me. This pandemic was tragic. It also revealed the hidden innovators and entrepreneurs, young, very young. For example, in my country, Somalia, at the first days of the pandemic, there was a critical shortage of PPE. There were no face masks. My country had only less than 3 ventilators with a population of 15 million. So a businessman in Mogadishu, the capital, started producing face masks that were locally produced with local materials. He was producing every day 34 to 40,000 face masks per day. And that was very helpful. There was another innovator, young, very in his early 20s, Muhammad. He produced with only what he found in his environment. He produced locally automatic ambu bag that helps patients breathe, which was very helpful. That shows African young innovators and entrepreneurs with appropriate investment can come with creative ideas and improve the well-being and development of the continent and the countries. In Kenya, at the heart of the pandemic, Kenya started producing ventilators, which is a game-changing for Kenya health system and for overall the continent. Also, university students in Zimbabwe, in Liberia, were producing face masks, were producing PPE with local materials in their environment. Senegal started producing testing kit in the early days of the pandemic. Senegal started producing testing kits for COVID-19 that were only costing $1. They were costing $1. So that was very helpful, and it shows that with appropriate policy and appropriate investment, young innovators and entrepreneurs in the continent can come with solutions, and it shows that the solutions are on the ground.
That's absolutely fantastic. And also, too, this goes to the heart of Dr. Oridari. I'm going to let him go ahead and come up with his summary. And thank you for being back with us from your very wise words in the very beginning. But thank you for sharing about these best practices. I'm glad I asked that question because this goes to the heart of what this is all about, is how can Africans develop Africa for Africans, but also for the world. And I think you're sharing ideas that actually real on the ground situations can evolve if we allow them to evolve, and give the proper support. And all that is not just by money or donations, but it's about allowing the free spirit of Africans to be expressed. And I've traveled, 7 different countries, actually 15 different countries now on the continent. And I'm always amazed by the ingenuity and the intelligence that I'm coming in contact with on a day-to-day basis. And you certainly are exhibiting that today. Dr. Oridari, are you ready to give us your passing words of wisdom and insights from what we've heard this morning?
Yeah, thank you very much, Matt, Dr. Samuel. I think all the outstanding presentations, basically, they really need to evolve into a practical solution that will help to shape the new economic development of Africa. And Africa needs to look inwardly, as much as we tend to have, quite different theoretical frameworks, with various issues and challenges, various experiences and various issues that are quite very perennial into the African worldview. Africa needs to begin to find an African integration that will help to solve some of these serious issues that we've really identified. And I will go back again to my earlier presentations that if Africa is very serious to progress and move forward into a new transformation of economic development, what Africa needs to do is to align all the countries, 54 countries, need to align very well into the African Integration Agenda of 2063 of African Union. And by using the benchmark of the planning of African Development Bank as the right tool, of shaping the country. And of course, we will need all hands to be on deck, working together, to actually bring out the best of Africa. Never forget, by 2050, we're going to have an explosive in the population of Africa, most especially among the young folks. They're have so much of entrepreneurial spirit and power. Some of them are full of ideas and technology. They have so much in their head in agriculture. They want to turn agriculture around from the way it used to be, and want to bring so much into the table. I mean, look at our medical students, look at medical practitioners that are so everywhere in the world. I've had to interact with many of our politicians in Africa who come abroad to US, to UK, to Japan, and they meet with Nigerian doctors, they meet African doctors, who eventually they are so shocked to see the same African treating them in a different new world. It's important that we find, what connects Africa together, and African friends and brothers should come together to fulfill the new dreams of Africa and make Africa as one of the best, part of the, a greater economic global glory that Africa deserves. And I think I will submit with this. And I believe that we all need to work together to achieve that dream, the dream of New Africa for the Africa, having the right democracy that actually suits well into the heart of Africa. And I believe that when we do this together and move forward with the practical solutions from this conference, not just talking theory, there'll be a whole lot of conferences and theories, and propounding materials, I've actually generated from different scholars, emeritus professors. We must find very clear practical solutions to solve the challenges of Africa. and work collectively together to fulfill that mission. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to say I first was on the continent in 1976 and visited and traveled in 7 countries looking at co-ops and agriculture, which I know is near and dear to your heart. And the whole thing about what's coming for Africa is actually rediscovering that the real green new businesses, the real green new jobs is in agriculture. And then you have the manufacturing to support the agriculture as you need it, and then get the products into the communities, throughout the African continent. I think it's absolutely incredible. But the good doctor here was sharing what's going on in Somalia and Sudan and other places. And it's just amazing how people will rise to the occasion, invent, create, and take care of their people. And I think that's very, very important. Mary, I'm going to turn it back to you. I think you said you do have a substitution for one of your speakers that you wanted to introduce. And so I'm going to put it back to you, and then you just tell me how you want to go forth with the next panel. And thank you to everybody who was in this panel. You'll be getting a thank you note to express our appreciation for the wise words that were shared here. And I'm sure, Mary, that people will be able to make contact with our speakers in the future. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. And back to you, Mary.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Hancock. I want to thank each and everybody that is on this panel. And special thanks to our opening remark, Dr. Oyederi. Thank you so much. Special thanks to the panelists. Thank you so much. Actually, the next panel, we have changes, but I wanted to first know whether they are already in the audience. Do we have Kanoteri? Hello? Is Kanoteri, are you on? Okay, do we have Reverend Ambrose? Hello? Frank, do you see Ambrose, Reverend Ambrose? I think okay, that was the next panel that we are supposed to be having, but I think they might be signing in. But while we are waiting for them, I just wanted to make a comment on Abduru's presentation. The reason why we had to get young people's voice is to show how actually Africa needs that kind of energy for the new world we are talking about. And he spoke of the one kit, $1 kit. Basically, I think we appreciate the initiative, but I think we can do more than a $1 kit for COVID. And that was the purpose of prioritizing infrastructure, health infrastructure, education infrastructure, food security, and clean water. As you have seen from all the panelists, we can't get much of all if we don't have all those kind of things in place. So I want to thank him for that. And I hope, Terry is there. Okay, good. Okay.
Do we have Dr. Carol, Mary?
Yeah, Terry and Carol, I think they should be in. I can see him.
Okay, yeah, Dr. Carol, I just saw his photograph there.
Yes, Terry's.
Okay, Lieutenant Colonel Terry Ronald.
Yes,
then we have Harrison Lee and Dr. Barbara.
Okay, that is
Smith.
the change actually we're having on Harrison Lee. He's not in, but I just got a replacement for him right now. As I was telling you, this is what it takes. It's like, it's not a static work. Sometimes you get call outs, and therefore it's like you would do the scheduling. If you have done scheduling, for those ones who are in military, you will go together. For those ones who are into healthcare, would go together. So it's like you are going to really operate at unpredictable sometimes schedule, but flexibility mindset allows it to flow well. So if we have Terry, oh yes,
Mary, I think everyone is here.
Okay.
So do you want to go ahead and start with the next panel?
Okay, the next, what I will do, I will introduce the new person and then I hand over, since you seem to be managing time so well, more power to you. But let me introduce the new speaker. Do we have Faustin in? Ambassador Faustin, are you in? Ambassador Faustin, are you in? Okay, so what we can do, let us start with the first two, and then maybe he will be joining because he's just actually part of the panel right now. So go ahead and we introduce Terry and Reverend, and then I'll wait for the third panelist to introduce.
Okay.
Again, more to you.
We'll go ahead and get started. We have Dr. Ambrose Carroll who's going to be with us. And thank you, sir, for being here and sharing the information with us. I don't know if you heard the earlier speakers, but it was very comprehensive, looking at the continent, what we must be doing, a little bit of the past, but actually more looking at the future when you're going to have over 2 billion people on the African continent, and that will not be too many decades ahead. So Dr. Carroll, if you want to go ahead and start sharing with us, they already have your bibliography, and quite impressed. And thank you for sharing with us. And I will be keeping a strict time schedule. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here, to be in this dialogue. Did have an opportunity to listen to some of our earlier speakers. But curious if I can share my screen. That could be helpful. Again, I am Pastor Ambrose Carroll. I pastor the church by the side of the road in Berkeley, California, and am the founder of an organization called Green the Church, which is working to be a repository and a catalyst for environmental and sustainability work within faith traditions. Let me see if I'm able to share.
Mary, can we do the screen share, please? Mary? Let me see if we can get that for you.
Fantastic. I'll go
just
through.
Keep speaking, and we'll see if we can get that up for you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So Green the Church has been working with the African American, primarily faith communities nationally, really working not simply on things that we are against, but attempting to work on things that we are for. As you all know, African people throughout the diaspora, not only has our land been used, listening to the conversations earlier about the underdevelopment of Africa, listening to the reality.
Hey, your slides are up, Dr. Carroll.
All right, those are, let me see. Those are actually not my slides.
Oops.
And that's fine.
That's okay. Mary, we got a boo-boo. We'll get them for you.
Yeah. Listen, don't worry about that at all. I'll just take a little bit of your time and tell you our pillars. Again, we are focusing on 3 things. First of all, amplifying what I call, or what is called green theology, really beginning to talk to our congregations about the foundation of how we see ourselves in the world, really beginning to ask poignant questions about not just the context of the Bible or what's in the Bible, but beginning to talk about the overarching context of how the Bible came to be, really looking at African history and understanding our reality before Western slavery, before colonization, and really beginning to work to what Dr. Kinney of the Sam Proctor School of Religion said, really working to decolonize the Black church itself, really beginning to look at ourselves not as captive foe, but as people who have power. And so we are really spending time, even in the United States, looking at, our communities are communities that have been in areas that have been made to be ghettos in the rural South, where my grandparents in Louisiana grew up and lived in the late 1970s, early 1980s. They were still living in houses without running water, when there were still oil pumps running next door on the land adjacent. And the way that we or our society uses the land and ignores the lives of people has been a constant. And so with Green the Church, we're trying to amplify green theology, a theology that looks back, a theology that attempts to connect with God, a theology that does not see white supremacy as the North Star. And then also beginning to, we're going to amplify green theology, promote sustainable practices, and build power for change. So when we talk about sustainable practices, it is kind of the culmination of what we have together. And so our congregation,
I think my group is over. I can see it there.
thank you. So our churches are working to really take a toll and account on what we own. We do not own a lot of skyscrapers in downtown areas, but we own a lot of faith buildings. And all of those faith buildings, institutions need to be retrofitted. And so we are taking account of the buildings that we do own. And I don't care if they are storefronts or cathedrals. We are taking account of the land that our churches own and that our communities own throughout the United States of America, and beginning to, talk about things like food sovereignty, beginning to understand food systems, beginning to use our places of worship and our communities as places in the urban environment, reaches out to our Black farmers and make sure that the food that they grow or the cattle that they raise has a place for distribution. Really working to revisit and look at just energy efficiency, and noting that just like my grandparents lived below par in terms of what was available, that many of our communities are being left out when it comes to things like energy efficiency, renewable energy, making sure that our children are part of what they call STEAM, science, technology, engineering, agriculture, and mathematics. Making sure that the health disparity does not continue to broaden. Making sure that our communities, which in the 1970s, when Martin King was marching against and marching and having the Poor People's Campaign, we note that Richard Nixon in the United States of America came and began to build out food subsidies, began to give us food-like substances with a lot of high fructose corn syrup and no health, no healthy food. And so looking at our levels of diabetes, hypertension, asthma rates in our communities, understanding that our communities were posited and put in industrial places where people came in from the suburbs to work, but where all the factories and the toxins were available. And we're beginning to look out at that and make sure that our congregations are speaking out about environmental injustices. And so I'm saying all of this from an African-American context, but understanding that that African Americans are people of the African diaspora. And until we begin to really learn how to trade amongst ourselves, until the pastors, clergies, bishops come together and be able to talk to spiritual leaders on the continent, in the Caribbean, that we will not be what God intended us to be. And so we come into this conversation trying to understand in a real way how we can be helpful, how we can indeed connect, how we can have an understanding of what's moving on the continent, and how we definitely believe that Africa is for the Africans. And for so many years, our people, we are right in the middle, as you all know, not only of COVID-19 and the health divide there, that we are dying more on this continent from that, but also the Black Lives Matter campaign is definitely growing steam. It is a stressful period. It is a period where this morning we've heard there have been 5 African-American men found hanging from trees. And so we are in a very interesting time, but we believe that crucial times like this are times for great innovation. Crucial times like this are times for great movement and for great coming together. And so with that, we are delighted to be on the call. Our last prong, I'll mention again, amplifying green theology, promoting sustainable practices, and building power for political and economic change. That is that after we have began to do these practices, after we have began to understand that African people have been doing more with less for a long time, and that we have a lot to teach in this sector, that there's something about agriculture and something about the land and the planet that we know is spiritual, that we know that God exists in the midst of everything. And that finally we will bring all of those individuals together and build power for economic change. People around here talk about the vote, and I think that voting is necessary, but ultimately we are talking about power. Individuals say, well, Black folks need jobs, Black folks need industry, and we need entrepreneurship. We need to be God-like, we need to be creators. And with that, again, I say good morning. Glad to be on the call and look forward to further dialogue. Thank you. I believe you're on mute.
Are you still on mute, sir?
Dr. Samuel, you are on mute. We cannot hear you.
Speaking away. Anyway, I was talking to you, Dr. Carroll, saying that one of the key points you brought out is that you're people of power. And I think that's very important. And that goes across everything. And that's, the faith tradition we have through the Bible, also the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, depending on our religious backgrounds, and tying this all together with heaven, earth, and humankind is the way we want to be going forth in the future. If we did, we wouldn't be having a lot of these problems we're having, and you just mentioned about today. So thank you very much for being here. Mary, do you want us to continue to have the speakers, and then we'll have Q&A at the end? Mary? Okay, yeah. I'm going to go ahead and we did this the first time. This is Lieutenant Colonel Terry Ronald. Thank you for being here. We haven't had the military perspective yet this morning, and we certainly appreciate you being here and sharing your information. We posted your very extensive resume in the chat, and I want to say that if everyone will look at the chat feature, you'll see the various resumes that we have. So, Lieutenant Colonel Ronald, please take it away.
Good morning, everyone. First, I want to say greetings from Upper Marlboro, Maryland. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you today, and continued blessings and prayers to everyone during this transformative time in the world. May I dare say an awakening has started to take hold of all of our lives, from being separate cities, counties, states, countries, continents, to becoming one world through providing education, uplifting, cutting-edge healthcare, and improved living conditions for the betterment of all. We will truly be one world, and only then will we all reap the benefits of what truly is being a human being, and not until then. Always remember, We must stop talking at one another and start listening to one another and improve our common goals and discuss differences in a collective, fruitful way with our hearts. Only in this one way, the world will be one body and one heart. And in saying that, my perspective is from being in law enforcement for over 30 years. I've come across many religious, many nationalities in my day-to-day occupation. I've seen a lot. I've done a lot. I want to first talk about what some aspects of building a citizen-central leadership across America or anywhere, because we see so much turmoil going on in the world, not just here in America, but in the world, from injustice. I want to start by saying, no matter what type of leadership we talk about or want to have a dialogue about, if we don't have a partnership amongst everyone to have their voices heard, none of this will work. I don't care how long you talk. I don't care how long you bring ideas from one group to another. Partnership, true partnership is the key. All parties in a situation must have an understanding. I know here in the United States, is speaking about the injustices and transparency in law enforcement. Citizens want to have an understanding of what's going on. That's their right. That's our obligation in law enforcement, to serve and protect. We must be transparent with the citizens across all spectrums as to tell them about the use of force and how it is implemented. Also about operational procedures, along with the process of addressing training and hiring of individuals to serve and protect. Let me first go into that aspect of it. The use of force. We saw a murder being committed on video. It was a murder. Through all training that I've gone through and taken throughout my career, the person was murdered. There's no place for that type of behavior. And those who stood idly by, meaning those law enforcement officers who were there along with that individual, should be equally charged. The term "my brother's keeper," as far as in public service to others, needs to be implemented across the board. You cannot idly stand by while your brother, regardless of nationality, religion-based, or whatever, is subject to abuse. That is your sworn duty as a law enforcement officer, to protect, serve and protect, no matter who is in your employ. My credo, as far as going through my lengthy career, was I'm not the judge nor the jury. My job is to bring someone to justice. At that particular time, once you're in my employ, my job is to serve and protect that person, no matter what I think or did not think the person has done. That's not my job. My job is to serve, protect. Even if you're in my custody, I'm supposed to preserve and protect your life to right in all aspects. We must adhere by that, because that's a human fundamental of life. And we can all just have to live by that credo. When we talk about equalities of community in law enforcement, I look at it this way. If you're not vested in your community, you're not going to be a part of your community. I am totally for those who enforce the law in a community must live in that community. You will not take ownership of anything if you're not a part of something. I see different officers who do not know the basics of what goes on in the community. It should be mandatory that all officers partake in community events in the area that they patrol, that they get to know the people that they serve and protect each and every day. That they just don't see them coming out of a car. I should know that person's name who's serving and protecting my community. I should have a feeling of being safe. But that is not the case in America right now. And I want to say that 95% of those who serve and protect do it in the way it's supposed to be done. There is that fraction of officers who do not, and we need to weed them out. There's no ifs, ands, buts about it. One aspect of all of what's going on with relationships to injustice is the mental aspect that is pushed upon those who are abused and murdered. Right now, those of color are living in fear. There is no excuse for that. We, as an organization, whether it's law enforcement, the government, must make sure and send a loud voice that justice will prevail. That those that we hire to serve and protect are there to serve and protect, and not for self-interest. Only then will we have the confidence in the citizenship and those of color to feel safe and secure, not only in the streets, but in their homes. I say all of this because this means a lot to me. You take an oath for a reason. You take an oath to serve and protect, not for the accolades you may receive, not for the prizes you may win, but for the common sake of serving and protecting one's neighbor. This is something that should run dear to everyone who's serving the capacity of law enforcement. This is not something to take lightly. And I hope, and let me say, I demand of those in law enforcement to take that oath to heart, serve and protect all. And in saying that, I'm one who does not speak a lot as far as long-winded. I'm kind of direct in my aspects of looking at things. And I feel as though we all have to come together in addressing these issues, because law enforcement here in the United States is no different than in Africa, than in Europe, and anyone else. You have the good and the bad. And we have to come together to eradicate the bad. Only in that way we can, and I say again, live as one world. And with that, I thank you. Oh, I can't hear you, Dr. Hancock. You're on mute again.
Yes. I'm saying you're finishing a little early. Would you like to continue a little longer?
Oh, I thought it was a little.
Well, I have you down. Everybody gets 20 minutes, so I want to give
Oh, I
you
thought it was
the
just
same
10
equal
minutes. I'm
share.
sorry. No, I just had 10 minutes and it was from there to question and answering. But if
Okay, well, we're going to be doing that. Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Excellent comments. And I know this really grieves you, and I'll say this before we introduce the next speaker. You have all this experience in law enforcement and a military background, and still a person of faith. And so you're constantly, how do we balance, our faith with the realities of the world? And I say often, the devil is alive and well on planet Earth, and we have to be the hands and feet of God. And I think that comes out in your message. That certainly came out in the message that Dr. Carroll has. But every one of the speakers here, I think, have that same feeling and that same mission and vision of life. And so thank you for sharing that and giving us your insights. Is Harrison Lee here?
We are going with the Dr. Barbara.
Oh, and Barbara is going to come up now, Dr. Smith?
Yes.
Oh, you want her now? Okay. All right. Is Dr. Barbara Pullen Smith, are you ready to come on? I'll introduce you.
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Okay.
I can't.
Thank you for being here.
Okay, sure.
And thank you for sharing the fact about your new book. I'm going to announce it, The New Woman in the Mirror. And I know that the journey that you've taken both professionally and personally resonates with the people here and also with the public. And thank you for being here to share. We put up your extensive resume, so I don't need to go through all that. But thank you for joining us. You do have a full 20 minutes. And so we'll take it from there. But thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hancock, for the introduction, the kind introduction. And I did need to share my screen, Mary, just the one slide. So do I have permission to share it?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. It's saying it's still disabled.
Can you mute in the background though?
It's not my background. It's somebody else has a line.
If you're not speaking, please be on hold so that we mute so that we get a clear. Okay, are you able to share?
No, it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
No, I am now sharing.
Okay.
Are you able?
Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Let's see. We'll see.
I just enabled it there.
Okay, thank you. Nope, it's still saying it's disabled. Let's see here.
It's not coming up, Mary.
Yeah. It's not because I just disabled from my side. I mean, do you see it now? Because I can see her.
Stop. Do you want to?
Miss Barbara, I believe you can do it. You can share.
Okay.
I got it.
Okay, good. You're on now?
I got it.
Okay, good.
Can you all see that?
Let me see. Me, I can see it.
It says you're starting. There you go. Okay.
Okay.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Yes, it's just the one slide. Okay.
It's just one. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And again, sorry about that little technical challenge there. But definitely, I'm just excited to be a part of this discussion. And thank you, Mr. Udofia, for inviting me, and Mary for your support and guidance. And I really do appreciate all the panelists who've spoken this morning and for sharing your insights. So it went away again, Mary.
Went away?
Yeah. Okay.
Rogers, could you act from your side then?
All right,
I'm
try
reason I
again.
can't.
There we go.
Okay,
All right,
okay, back. Is it
perfect. So hopefully that'll stay.
okay,
And
good.
so,
Okay, there it is. Sorry.
perfect. Yes, we did it. As I was saying, I'm certainly grateful to be joining this important conversation. And my disclaimer is simply, I don't purport to have all the answers, but I certainly am speaking from the lens that I have of 35 plus years of public health experience. And I do want to share just some of the challenges, but some of the public health strategies that have been proven. So, certainly right now, there is this public outcry around the world, against all of the racial injustice and also a public, and rightfully so. I mean, it's just unconscionable what we're dealing with right now. And the world is also crying out against the disparities around COVID-19 in terms of Blacks contracting and dying at higher rates from the pandemic, from the virus. And so I've been just really asking myself, what is it? What's the collective ask? What is it that we need to do? What is it that we need from outside of the Black community, but also what is it that we need from inside the Black community? And so I needed a way to kind of frame my remarks. And so I thought this slide, and I want to take time and kind of go through each of the constructs in this slide, because it helps me to sort through the rhetoric. It helps me to sort through the noise. There's a lot of people talking. There's a lot of stuff that's being said, but how do we get to the get to? Because that's all I'm about, getting to the get to. So what are we even asking for? Are we really talking about equality? We're talking about equity? Are we talking about justice? So the constructs are very complex. So let me just kind of talk you through each one and then kind of come out of that with some public health strategies that have been proven that can be replicated wherever we are. The reality, this pictorial really demonstrates the disparities. And those disparities are significant differences between population groups, right? And those differences are unfair. Those differences are unjust. And that many of the factors that created these realities we're dealing with can be addressed through systemic change. But you also have to factor in so many of the social determinants and those things that people talk about. Well, poor people, being poor is one of the greatest predictors of poor health. Absolutely. One of the social determinants: unequal access to healthcare, lack of education, the stigma, and of course, the ugly roots of racism. Now, all that's going on in the world has certainly uncovered and exposed racism. But this thing is so deeply embedded within systems. So it's uncovered. But how do we dig it up? How do we get to the bottom line of all of this? So again, reality. These are the disparities that exist now. How do we get past it? So when we talk about equality, equality is pretty much, if you look at the structures, it's giving people equal amounts or the same amount of resources. But unfortunately, the fence, the systemic barrier, is still there. It just makes the system feel good because, we say, oh, well, we're treating everybody fairly. We're giving everybody the same thing. Well, not really. An example in point is just look at the current approach to making COVID-19 testing available. So if the COVID-19 tests were available at all the medical facilities, then certainly the system says, oh yeah, well, we're making it's free of charge. All people have to do is get there. Well, there you go. There are some of the barriers. What if people can't get there? What if people don't even know about where the resources are to even help them? So what about past history? What about the lack of trust of those medical facilities that people are not even going to go in? So if you've not addressed that, then yeah, the system feels good in saying, well, we've made it free to everybody, but that doesn't mean everybody gets to get it. So how do we break down that? So we look at health equity. On the other hand, that's when we start to really look at some of the structures and the barriers that really get to some of the social determinants of health, that looks at the lack of equal opportunity for health. And I'm saying health because my training and background is public health, but it doesn't matter what you plug in. This discussion is the same. Whether you're talking about economic health, whether you're talking about education, health, whether you're talking about physical health, whether you're talking about mental health, it is the same discussion. So I look at health equity really is, to me, is when we see health equity, we see equity happening at the point when systems start owning up to their part in helping to create the disparities in the first place. Simple as that. The system itself owns up to contributing to some of the problems. So health equity is achieved when every person gets what they need to attain their full potential. And again, across the board, whether you're talking about education, mental health services, physical health services, economics, it's the same. So what do we do to create equity? And equity means that somehow the factors that kept people down in the current reality slide, in the reality section, that those things have now been accounted for, have been addressed. And that is some of the social positioning and, some of the social positions people find themselves in, some of those social determinants, like being poor. One of the things that's really clear as we talk about achieving equity is that it's going to require policy changes. It's got to go to the deep root of the deep root in terms of systems and requiring policy changes. So equity strategies give support needed to reach above the system. But if you look at, even in this illustration, even in equity, the barriers are still there. The systemic barriers are still there. So then we say we want justice, absolutely. And I see justice as the dream. Removing the fences, removing the barriers so that everybody, there are no barriers, so that the systems now are just for everyone. So that's why I use this illustration of equity and how we get there, because it helps, as I said, it helps me to kind of think through, okay, so what? So we know this. So now that we know what we're asking for, and so that helps us to respond to the things that we see and hear. And I'll speak about that in a little bit, I think, in a different way, because we are able, with this framing, and if we frame our thinking like this, we're able to cut through some of the rhetoric and cut through some of the noise. So COVID-19 disparities just, it seemed to shock so many people, so many leaders. And what it did was it just ripped off. It ripped off the Band-Aids. It ripped off all of the, I guess, the very shallow covering for the world to see what people who've worked in this field, who've worked in public health, who are in the healthcare system, who see this day in and day out, But now the world sees that there's this ugly and oozing and festering sore that's there and it's been there. So it's COVID-19 has uncovered, for example, the disproportionate burden of chronic diseases and conditions that have caused Blacks to contract and die from the virus at higher rates. I mean, whether you're talking about, heart disease, diabetes, the things that people have to take medications for, those things that have compromised our immune systems, those things that have been going on for, unfortunately, generations and generations. So that's uncovered the disproportionate burden. It's also uncovered that the social determinants that I've talked about, lack of access to healthcare, lack of resources, lack of education, health illiteracy, public health services, all of these things, lack of access to the basic preventative care that people need, all of these things that of course are impacted by poverty. COVID-19 disparities have also revealed something that's very troubling to me, and that is the inconsistency in collecting and reporting COVID data by race. Now, if we don't know who's impacted at the higher rates, how do we know where to target the resources? And I think, like I can say in America, I think that's what we were witnessing. In the beginning, it was just reporting just by cases. And then once we started looking more carefully and asked the right questions, is there a difference? That's when the shock of it for some people that, COVID-19 data revealed that Blacks were experiencing these, not only the contracting the virus, but dying at higher rates from the virus. And then so now I'm still questioning, are the resources keeping up with it, with that data? COVID-19 also uncovered the necessity for more contact tracing. Again, more contact tracing in our communities so that there is some systematic way to identify and monitor those who are at risk or are at risk of spreading COVID-19 so that, they can be tested and go through the public health protocols, of course, to contain the virus. So we haven't been able to cut it off. And so now we are still in the midst of that in terms of seeing the disproportionate impact in the Black community, but we're also lagging behind in terms of the testing and the tracing. And so it also uncovered the lack of access to needed testing for COVID-19 in the Black communities. It uncovered inadequate communication of the risks to Black folks. Now that one is the one that still is so disturbing to me. Just the risk communications and how things have not happened. So we can't let any of these issues that I've listed go back under the cover. And I think that's why this conversation today is really important, but it's got to be a collective ask. And, I heard some of the speakers from earlier just talk about investing in the infrastructure. It's the infrastructure for the existing public health system, but it's also the infrastructure for what the new public health system needs to look like. So moving forward, what would we say are just our collective vision beyond the virus? So how do we prepare Black people to speak with one voice, no matter where we are? And this is so that we are prepared for the next thing. There's always going to be a next thing that's going to hit our communities. It just is. We have to look at both what we need to do within the Black community, but also what do we need to ask for outside of the Black community? Because we're talking about strategies to build citizen-centered leadership. We're talking about how do we create equitable communities, and what are some of the socioeconomic plans or models that we can put in place. I've honestly been trying to think about how do we, for real, become integral partners in the public health response moving forward. And of course, the public health response and the approach being used is identification, isolation, contact tracing. And part of that has to do with building infrastructure in our communities. So one issue is just around risk communications going forward. So people throw around the term community engagement all the time, but knowing, I mean, it is labor intensive and it takes time to build an engaged community, to build the trust in communities, to build the independence in communities. But it starts by investing in the people. And so somehow we've got to get more Black leaders in the community to be engaged in the response. Again, I'm really thinking about preparing for the next thing, the next virus, the next thing. And I know the messenger always matters. It always matters. The messenger always matters. So there certainly is a need to figure out ways to hire what I call risk communicators from the community. I mean, I'm talking people from the neighborhoods, the zip codes, where we know by the data that have had the greatest impact around COVID-19, for example. Because I've been asking the question, from whom and how is the need for testing then communicated? I'm still baffled by that. And who is the Black community listening to? And how do we know who they're listening to? Are some questions that still baffle me. Also, in terms of beyond the current pandemic, I almost see a need to build these networks around the country, the world, that would be called like neighborhood risk communicators. And they are trusted leaders in the community that the people themselves will identify now as those trusted leaders. And these are people beyond the titles. I mean, you know, we tend to kind of go to the titles and all of that. And we are, in terms of an ongoing approach, we need to also, I think, just look at the data. And in the, like, for example, again, we should all be demanding that race is a required element for all COVID testing and data collection and reporting. And so COVID-19 certainly has demonstrated to me and to us that our communities cannot afford to be treated like everybody else. We just can't, we can no longer afford to accept that. And I also think that we should all be demanding that we generate, that there are plenty of academic institutions, including historically Black colleges and universities, that can help us to generate these national heat maps. And that way, so we can geographically identify the target locations of the spread of COVID-19 cases and the mortality by race, of course, with an emphasis on Black communities. And after that point, we need to fight for data-driven funding decisions so that we really know where we need to go, how we need to go, when we need to go into these different communities. So risk communications, data, and then testing. And of course, we know that there have not been adequate resources
Dr. Smith,
identified.
1 more minute.
Oh, wow. Cool. Great. Thank you.
I'm giving you a gift of 1 minute.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. To stop the spread. And so establishing mobile testing sites in the Black communities based on the heat maps, of course, and the need to demand that mobile test sites are in the best locations for the populations at higher risk. I mean, I hear about these test sites popping up, but did anyone ask the people at higher risk if they're in the right places? And how do we engage grassroots leaders, especially nonprofits, our nonprofits and faith-based organizations? And I can say that one faith-based model in the US is coming out of Charlotte, North Carolina, and it's called Village Heartbeat. And that model has been in place for managing chronic diseases. And these pastors have been toiling for many, many, many years to address chronic diseases. But what has been amazing, it's been a best practice. And so the World Council of Churches recently adopted this best practice model and developed a guidebook for the network. And so there are models out there. I guess I say all that to say that in terms of more health workers, absolutely, we need to shore up. I heard the doctor talk about that earlier. And so recruiting and hire contact tracers from the neighborhoods and the zip codes, building this long-term capacity in our communities too. It's not just the right now, it's the long-term capacity. So we can become health advocates and mobilize our own health. So we need more community health workers who are hired so that they can help to provide non-medical care, support, services, and resources, help with dealing with issues of isolation, medication adherence, emotional support, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there are plenty of models around for that. And then, of course, getting research. But the bottom line is nobody's coming to save us. Nobody's coming to save us. Dr. Hancock, nobody's coming to save us.
I know that. And I agree with you. And that's why I'm letting you make this very powerful statement.
And I'm going to stop at that.
Okay, wonderful. You did a fantastic job. And the whole thing about what you brought out of many different ideas and excellent challenges to society as a whole is that we need to make things accessible. When I was very much involved in Richmond, Virginia, and all the different communities, accessibility was a key factor. And just because you say, well, we have it available at this clinic or this location, majority of the people can't get there.
That's right.
And even in Washington, D.C., many people can't get there. Doesn't matter if it's in a few blocks. It's based, on your age. It's based on your physical conditions. There's many of these factors that we have to now start paying attention to if we're going to be equal across everyone within our society. And thank you for sharing, and your master's in public health really paid off in your presentation today. So thank you for being here, and also being a consumer of health services as you were. I'm sure this has really had a profound impact on how you're looking at things. But thank you for being here. Mary, it's back to you. I believe we have an ambassador that's coming on to speak with us.
Okay.
And I'm going to turn it back to you, and then you let me know if I need to do anything else besides listen and be around all these wonderful, smart, dynamic people.
All right, Ambassador, are you there? Ambassador, are you there? Do you hear me? Hello? Hello?
If he's not, Mary, if you don't get him back, I'll start asking a few questions. If that's
Yeah,
okay.
sure. Let me.
I'm going to leave it with you.
Yeah,
you just let me know when you want me to take it
You
back
can
over.
be posing questions. Let me just see if he's there.
Well, I would like to go ahead and ask a question, and this is going to be to Dr. Abdulli and also to Dr. Smith. He is working on the African continent in very stressed areas like the Sudan, Somalia, and other areas. Dr. Smith, you're working in very stressed communities within the United States. And even though these are 10,000 miles away from each other, many of the challenges are really the same. So, Dr. Abdullah, are you still here?
No, you should be able to unmute yourself through your email.
Okay. If you can unmute him.
Wait. Jack?
Dr. Smith, do you want to address that? And how do we really reach into the communities and make them feel a part of it, but also empower them so that, as you said, nobody's coming here to save us? And this is true of all of us. We have to save ourselves, and we have to be our greatest advocate. How do people do that when the system is, we have this brain trust out here, you're the consumer, there is this gulf. How do we close that gulf? Because most people actually know more about their own health than many of the professionals that profess they know everything they need to know. I'm going to put it back to your hands.
Thank you again. Great question. And I think part of the hard work, it's HEART work and HARD work. It's hard work and heart work.
Right.
Is investing in the people and helping people to become more knowledgeable. And also that's why the model, like the community health worker model, which people need to be paid though. I mean, I think that's the thing. We volunteered enough. We've been extensions of health systems and have been worked and been taken advantage of in a lot of ways because we are depending on the goodwill of people. Well, we need to invest in people. We need to make sure that we give people a place at the table. And you know, I was thinking about right now, I mean, we have so many big corporations who are, they just have money out there just saying, you know, well, you know, we're going to be funding now, we're funding a diversity and inclusion initiative. We're taking our people through implicit bias training. Well, do you wonder, so how are they going to measure their progress? Have you figured that out? I don't know how they're going to measure progress with that. And what difference is that going to make to that person that doesn't even trust the system enough to go and get testing, right? And that's why we gotta take the resources in the community. So if we know corporations that are talking about investing in dealing with organizations that are against racial injustice, those are the kinds of funds that we need to invest. We need to direct those funds to invest in those communities and in the people through training, through building networks of community health workers, through building networks of neighborhood risk communicators for the future, because this is not even about just right now. If we don't put some things in place that's going to start a different conversation, we're going to always be in position where we are depending on the goodwill of the empathetic and the friendly CEO, governor, mayor, legislator. And I think that's what we're seeing now. But until the policies change, so it is not just about the money. It is literally about the policies that are in place that are contributing to the disparities. If there are people in position right now that have a goodwill, that's who we need to be talking about and talking to. That's who
also talking about is okay too.
Only to identify them. After that, let's just get to them.
Right.
But
well, you know, the whole thing, Dr. Smith, you're talking about is the talking to the people of goodwill that have become apparent through the COVID-19. That really is an excellent point, is how do we take that and then move them towards the policy changes that we need? Because if they are of goodwill, then it should be easier, a softer sell, if you will, to bring them to the policy changes that we do need. And then that benefits all future generations and the people that have needs for the future. So
Strike while it's
actually
hot.
your point was very, very well taken. Were we able to get back Dr. Abdullah back? Mary?
Yes.
Dr. Abdullah, are you here? Okay, I can't seem to see if he's here or not. But going to Lieutenant Colonel Terry and your background and your work, we were talking about the faith, the organizations, policing, protecting the community, but at the same time be of goodwill, good cheer. But how do we use the words that Dr. Smith just shared for us, as that we need to make these bridges now so that everyone in society is protected and have the resources they need, and it's not just for a narrow sliver here or there, or it's just somebody's goodwill. It needs to be something now that we institutionalize, that the society is of goodwill. And I don't know if you agree with that or not, but it seems to come out in your manner and your spirit, is that your system, which is, you know, law and order, protect people, still has to be human and provide the, I guess, that pillow of society to protect all humans equally the best way we possibly can.
That's correct. If we lose being humanized in the law enforcement capacity, then we lost everything.
Right.
It's about serving one another. And that's where a lot of, I say, people in general lose sight. They lose sight of what you're actually here for, in the service of others. Dr. Smith made a brilliant point. We have to hit while the iron's hot in a way that we're not doing it individually. We have to do it as a collective. You know, I see a lot of times, even in law enforcement, anything of merit, people have the best of intentions. But when they go out and want to start this group by themselves, that group by themselves, another group by themselves, we have 20 groups wanting to do the same thing, but none of them talk.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
we have to come together. We can all have separate groups, but bring those groups together. Mm-hmm. And then as a collective, that one voice will come clear, as opposed to 20 individual voices going in 20 different directions. We can all agree to disagree in how we want to approach things, but at the same time, if we come together as a collective to voice that one goal in a singular form, then you will be heard. You will be heard. See,
absolutely.
That's where a lot of this, I look at it right now, when we're looking at law enforcement and justice across America. See, right now, the key is divide and conquer. Mm-hmm. See, as long as we're not united in our mindset of seeking to abolish injustice, no matter how hard the road is going to take to get there, then those who want to put those landmines in our way, they'll continue to do it because they don't want to see the end. They want to continue this turmoil. Yeah. And as long as we don't have the collective mindset to move forward together, this is the golden opportunity to move forward together in this collective and not be deterred by any one force, but the force of doing right among all people. And that's my main thing. And I'm a man of color, but the goal is, and Dr. Smith put it quite eloquently, equality for all. See, that's Amen. What everybody wants when we look at the bottom line of it. If I'm looking at that fence, I want that fence eliminated so I can see everything. I don't want that barrier just for the person that's sitting underneath me or the one that's top. I want to be on a level playing field that we can all see the same thing and have the same opportunities.
That was a powerful graphic, Dr. Smith, and thank you for sharing it. Dr. Carroll, going to you, and your sustainability and you know, production, but every aspect of life. How do you see that fitting into what we were just talking about and Dr. Smith brought up as far as, again, this equality for all, but sustainability, resilience, you know, all these buzzwords that we have right now, and talking about your, in essence, theology of green, if I can shorten it a little bit, because I've been there a long, long time, ever since about 8 years of age. So how do we do that among all communities so that we all become part of the solution and we're not just all part of the problem?
Thank you. And again, just fascinated by all the dialogue. I won't take long. I just, my thought is, well, the words that come to me is as above, so below. I think that there is such a oneness in life, and we are really definitely caught in a lot of silos. I was thinking yesterday about the power of media itself. On one instance, and listening earlier, you know, we all got the message to kind of stay in our homes, and we saw and we felt the vigor and the vitality of that. During the marches over the last few weeks, not so much. So there was a different message, and a lot of people just kind of followed that message. Well, now it's time to get out in the streets. Ultimately, to be human, to be a sentient being, I believe is to be in lock and step, in harmony with the created order. What I'm trying to say is there are a lot of outside forces, but until we learn the maturation process of our spirit, of our humanity, until early on the call, the gentleman was talking about how some regions talk about growth. And he said that the longest journey is between here and here.
Right.
So even though we're talking about different people groups, different nationalities, it is the oneness of humanity. And it is really, and so even for our different religions that have oftentimes been co-opted and have been weaponized, that stories that were created for the purpose of the inner travel so that we become people of love, so that we can all be our brother, our sister's keeper, so that our first move is life-giving, and that things within us are not life-taking, that we are living in a very immature world. And a lot of people who look at the world and look at, we see the world and we look at scarcity, which brings up fear. And so we try to get as much as we can so that we can continue to be. But what we don't realize is that we've always been and we always will be. And so until we begin to mature, I want to say individually, but I mean much more than that. Mm-hmm. Because I think that the reality is we, in America, we grow and we look at what it means to be independent. But the highest form of growth and maturation is not our independence. It is not our power. The highest form of spiritual growth is interdependence. Mm-hmm. It is when we realize that we are connected to others, that we are connected to those who live in a different realm, and we are connected to those who come behind us, and that we don't fear the unknown. We don't fear the loss of breath, right? Because we believe that life is reciprocal. We believe that life is continuous. Right. And until humanity really grapples with that, until all of our, our little pieces of religiosity, as long as, and I don't care if you're a Buddhist, a Baptist, or a mathematician, truth is but one reality in all of us, no matter what, if it's science, theology, philosophy, it all moves to the same dynamic truth. And my prayer is that we get there. And I hope I said something. I don't think I preached on Sunday, so I'm feeling a little preachy.
That's okay. We're all doing a little bit of that. I'm still wanting to see if Abdullah, are you back with us? And he was having problems. Mary, do you want me to continue questions, or is the ambassador here? Mary?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, the ambassador's here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. All right. Mary, do you want to do the introduction? I think I've lost Mary.
I am. Do you hear me?
Okay, there you are. Welcome.
Okay.
We're waiting for you to introduce the ambassador, and we've had some excellent questions. I shouldn't say excellent questions. I gave the questions. We had excellent answers to some of my questions. So we're moving forward, but back to you as far as the ambassador is concerned.
Thank you so much. And so sorry for the little bit. This was a last minute connect. So I think we are doing good. The last speaker, I will take it from Terry, who said abolish injustice everywhere. And as an organization which promotes democracy, and we are covered by the first amendment, which is the freedom to express and share the ideas. My last speaker will be Ambassador Kayumba. Ambassador Kayumba holds a Bachelor of Arts in Law, a Master's in Global Security. He's the former Rwandan ambassador to India and former Army of Chief for Rwanda. So please allow me to welcome Ambassador Kayumba. And he's going to discuss what was the Marshall Plan of Germany, what were the enabling factors, what were the failures, can Africa do the Marshall Plan, yes or not? And without taking long, Ambassador Kayumba, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you so much, Dr. Sam. And thanks so much for all the participants. It's a pleasure being with you today. And I don't want to go back and reintroduce myself. And without much ado, I'll be doing my presentation with PowerPoint so that you could be able to share the screen.
Do you have a PowerPoint, sir?
Okay, are you able to share now?
Yes, Jack? Go ahead and put the PowerPoint up if you could, Mary, because I think he's ready to begin.
Jack, can you enable the PowerPoint the screen sharing, please, like we did for Barbara?
Yeah, you can start it. Let me get.
Yeah. Just like we did for Barbara, it should be able.
The host has to.
That's Roger. Roger, is there?
Yeah, I have a candidate who didn't get started.
That's okay.
Yeah, okay. Give me just a minute to see if I can get it done.
Well, while we trying to share the screen, let me possibly try to do a little bit of introduction. As you very well know, okay.
Are you able?
Not yet. As you very well know, the Marshall Plan is essentially.
Are you able?
No.
Okay, just present while Jack is working on that. No problem.
Mr. Ambassador, please proceed with your remarks.
Yeah, no, what about
and we'll see if we can get the equipment to work properly. And thank you for being here.
Right, thank you so much. Obviously, the Marshall Plan is the rehabilitation of Europe after the Second World War. And with the COVID-19, we are thinking how could Africa also be able to benefit from such a kind of financial assistance to be able to develop Africa after the devastating COVID-19. But in order to do that, one has first of all to ask himself, is debt cancellation a feasible proposition for Africa? Is it feasible? Number two, who would fund the package, the Marshall Plan for Africa? Who would do it? And thirdly, would we be able to compare the COVID-19 devastation with the Second World War? Now, when you do that, you have to look at the imperatives that informed the Marshall Plan. First of all, the Marshall Plan, okay, go up. Well, the Marshall Plan was informed by a number of imperatives. Number one, it was the political imperative, which was mainly the trial to unify Europe through economic integration on the US model, meaning that the intention was to build the United States of Europe with the help of America. The second consideration was the ideological reason, and the ideological reason was to fight communism. At that time, communism had started spreading in the parts of Eastern Europe, and Western Europe and America was afraid of communism. And therefore, they had to find a way of fighting communism. The third element was the social element, especially a lot of European immigration to the United States, who supported. They supported the Marshall Plan, and particularly that's why they came up with a bipartisan approval of the Marshall Plan. However, there's another underpin, which was the economic underpin, and that was to boost exports and imports from America to Europe and vice versa. We should also recall that there was also a diplomatic reason, because America had been in isolation. There was therefore an intention for America to place itself at the center of diplomacy in view of the fact that the Soviet Union was trying to impose itself on Europe. So America wanted to impose itself on Europe also. And thirdly, there was the problem that existed between the Soviet Union and the Allied forces and the blockade of Germany. And they had to create West Germany to make sure that countries like France, Greece, and Italy, which had communistic parties, had to be stopped, the spread of communism. And of course, there was the issue of security, because after Second World War, what would follow? Would therefore have Europe that would be fragmented? There was therefore a reason for them to create a security arena, and that security arena was meant to create NATO. In that regard, we look at those imperatives as the reason why the Marshall Plan was created. Now, let's look now at what is taking place in Africa.
Let's try and share now. So you're going to try share.
Let's try to look at what's taking place now in Africa. When you look at Africa, there is a little bit of a difference. The African Union is a loose kind of organization. European countries and America in particular would prefer to deal with individual countries instead of dealing with the African Union as a whole. In terms of economics, while there was an intention to build the European Union and to integrate European countries, in Africa, America prefers to deal with Africa on an individual basis through AGOA, the Africa Growth Opportunity Act. Instead of working together with Africa, they prefer to work with countries separately. Then there is a social kind of situation. While it was very easy, and a lot of Europeans after the Second World War were encouraged to migrate to Europe and America. Today in America, you see these issues of the immigration and the customs enforcement, ICE, trying to block people from Africa and other countries to migrate to America and other places. And certainly the question of communism is no longer there. There is no ideological reason that communism could be stopped, let me say, in Africa. And therefore that would encourage either Europe or America to work on a Marshall Plan. Then when it comes to security, while America was looking and Europe were trying to build NATO, in Africa, what we have is the AFRICOM. The AFRICOM is not based in Africa. It's based in Germany, in Stuttgart. And they just only deploy troops in Africa. We don't have forces in Africa that would force either America or Europe to be able to build a Marshall Plan for Africa for security reasons. And lastly, there is the diplomatic level. On diplomacy, America or Europe, they prefer to deal with Africa either through the State Department or through AFRICOM, and maybe through the UN, because America and the European countries, some of them are part of the permanent members. So they really don't need to establish themselves and look at Africa as a totality. They prefer to deal with Africa as a single states. So these are the impediments that you look at that would not be able to encourage either America or Europe to look at the Marshall Plan. However, when you look at Africa, what does it present? When you look at the slide on the right, you can see Africa is a myriad of disjointed nations. While after the Second World War, Europe was more or less integrated as states politically and economically almost homogeneous. Then there is a question of the deficit, political deficit in Africa and the problems of accountability. Yet that was not the situation that pertains after the Second World War. We also look at the situation of the multilateral debt relief of 2005. A lot of countries in Africa, the debt was completely wiped out. But what is the situation today? The situation today is that countries are more indebted than they were in 2005. And that's not encouraging for anybody to think about a Marshall Plan for Africa, because a lot of African countries have also accumulated a lot of debt. So people also look at what is the role of business in Africa. You find the amount of money that's given to Africa does not go to business. A lot of it goes to the ruling elite, and a lot of it is sometimes swindled and put into foreign banks. So these are some of the problems that Africa has. However, when you look on the other side, you'll see Africa is trying to make sure that we move towards a situation that would be conducive for us to be able to have a situation that a Marshall Plan could be possible. And what is that? You can see there is a tendency to move towards effective systems of governance, to make Africa a place to live, a place to work, and a place to invest. And some countries, not all of them in Africa, have actually made strides towards that direction. There is private sector innovation and finance. if you look at certain countries, particularly in Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, Botswana, you can see there is a lot of innovation and finance going into it and building a private sector. However, we need to accelerate industrial development so that we can go to curb on export of raw materials and processed commodities, and also vulnerability against external and internal shocks. And this is a big problem. We also need to make sure that we build on gender equality and the empowerment of women and youth, because this forms the majority of our population, and we need to empower the majority of our population, and that's the women and the youth. And then we move towards regional integration to be able to create a common market for Africa. And in order to do that, we need to look at climatic change, social development, data development, and then build an African continental free trade area. Now, these are the issues, if put together, would both entice and encourage investment in Africa, just like America was encouraged to invest in Europe after the Second World War. Now, when we do this, we look at the assumptions. There are a number of assumptions when you look at what can happen. And some of the assumptions are, do we have resources? Who is going to give the resources? Because today, when you look at America, the understanding, and particularly diplomatically, the policies are much more about America instead of looking at the whole world. Because if you look at what has taken place in America, it seems like America is now withdrawing again towards isolation instead of becoming an international leader. At the same time, we look at the capacity of the African countries. Do they have the capacity to absorb these loans? Some of them, yes. Some of them, no. And because Africa is not an integrated country, then you have these problems, because some countries can absorb, others cannot absorb. I had already talked about the question of indebtedness. I don't have to repeat. And then when you are going to allocate these resources, how do you allocate these resources? We must have empirical economic data that can be used to be able to know where these resources should be allocated. Then the question of monitoring. And also, we must recognize that when our resources are given to Africa, we have a lot of foreign consultants, people who go consulting and they take 30, 40% of the resources. Now, when we look at when the Marshall Plan was instituted, there were no such consultants that had to go and take money from Europe, except the 5% that was given the CIA to fight communism. So now, when we look at this, we have to compare it now with the COVID. What are you going to do with the COVID? Because we have COVID coming in, and we have to deal with the situation. And this is a comparative analysis. We look at the comparative analysis of COVID and the World War II as a precursor to be able to look at how you can be able to convince that we need a Marshall Plan. Number one, so many people, the fatalities, the people who died during the Second World War, we believe COVID won't kill so many to be able to attract this kind of situation. Number two, the Second World War completely destroyed the infrastructure in Europe, but COVID has kept the infrastructure intact. While you have lost people, not so many, but infrastructure remains intact. And therefore, people can be able to pick the capacities very quickly. The next thing is that the Second World War took 5 years, and maybe COVID may take a year, because we are told that within 1 year, we may have a vaccine. But most important, the United States of America provided the resources for the Marshall Plan. In this kind of situation, whom do we envisage to provide the resources? Particularly when the world is becoming towards much more of a popularist and some kind of nationalistic thinking. So who is going to provide the resources? Now, we have to go now to the aftermath of COVID. Having seen all this, what is the aftermath of COVID? The most likelihood in Africa is that there could be a rollback. There could be a rollback on the democracy that had already been obtained. We have seen certain countries, they have brought in laws, regulations that are so draconian. In which case, therefore, what do we expect to happen? You can see that certain countries that even refuse to have any regulations, and Tanzania, Burundi, these people have not had any regulations. Now, what is the accountability there? So there could be a rollback on the gains on democracy. Number two, there could be a pushback from the populations. Why? Because the social networks in Africa are so limited. While in Europe and America, people are being paid for not working, people are being fed. In Africa, that's not the situation. Is that sustainable? Maybe after COVID, we could see a lot of riots, we could see a lot of disabilities in Africa, and this could be a big problem. And it could have some social and economic unrest in Africa. Now, the world is much more divided than it was during the Second World War. And therefore, when you look at all these things, the aftermath of COVID, it becomes very, very complicated. And of course, the rise of nationalism and popularism in Europe. Now, these are the issues that we are looking at. Now, my question I'm supposed to answer is it possible to have debt relief, debt cancellation, and then have a plan like the Marshall Plan? And I would say that it is possible that we could have, in conclusion, we could be able to have debt cancellation in Africa. But if we have a debt cancellation in Africa and the creation of a Marshall Plan, there must be conditionalities. And what are those conditionalities? Number one, governance and the rule of law. If there is no governance and the rule of law, how do you monitor, how do you run a situation like the Marshall Plan in a dictatorship? That would be very, very difficult. Number two, how do you run a Marshall Plan in a situation where economies are disjointed? That's very difficult. Number two, we must look at the human rights violations and our human rights situation. What is the point of throwing money in a state where human rights are being violated? Who are the beneficiaries? If you throw money in a country where people are being killed, who are the beneficiaries? Number three, we have to look at the current debt of a country against the GDP. If a country has a debt already which could be above 56% of its national GDP, now how do you give them money? And when you cancel the debt, when these countries already had the debt cancellation, and with that cancellation, they accumulated more debt, what tells you that when you give them more money under, let me say, a so-called Marshall Plan, they won't even accumulate more debt? And that's a very big problem. So the answer therefore lies in accountability and the involvement of the private sector. If there is accountability and involvement of the private sector, then you can talk about the Marshall Plan, and of course, the empowerment of women and the youth. This is very, very important, because when you empower women, when you empower the youth, who form the majority, and who have proved, because the youth can be able to innovate. Women have proved that they can create wealth, and they are more frugal than men in Africa. And therefore, we believe that if you empower women, if we empower youth, and our Marshall Plan is moving towards that segment of society, we are likely to obtain positive results. However, we must now be able to look, when you are going to talk about Marshall Plan and the cancellation of debt, what are we talking about? We are talking about you free the interest rate now on the current debts people have, you forgive the principal payment, and then this money that has been freed can now go to development. However, and this is a caveat, there is a problem. When money is given to African countries, there are illicit flows into foreign safe havens. If you see in my slide here, in Mauritania in 2018, it was reported that $148 billion were drained out of Africa annually, and that's equivalent to 25% of the average GDP of Africa. Now, this is a very big problem. If you have countries, currently when they get aid, the aid is taken to foreign countries, it's going to be very, very complicated that even when you bring in money under the so-called Marshall Plan, money won't be stolen. However, what is my view? My view is that the Marshall Plan should be considered. The debts could be cancelled, country by country, having looked at every single country's record, and from each country's record, then you can be able to build those countries so they can be able to provide as an example for those others which are lagging behind to be able to become as case studies to be able to move. But not to look at countries, some of them which are dictatorships, some of them killing their own people, others who don't want to leave power, and we just throw money at them, don't want to be good for Africa. So we support debt cancellation. We support the building of Africa on the basis of Marshall Plan, but we must be very careful in how we implement. The implementation must be very clear so that we can be able to look at country by country, because there is nothing as to say there is anything uniform about Africa. And particularly in the view of the fact that what we have now and what was pertaining in the world during the World War is very different, because we don't know who would be able to give the money and who won't be able to give the money. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for speaking. Mary, we have actually 8 minutes left now before the official close.
Okay.
Do you want to give some questions to the ambassador, or do you want to have the final remarks? How would you like to proceed?
Actually, I have a question for the ambassador.
Excuse me?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So, so that we have seen the essence and the presentation was to give us a chance to do informed decisions as far as the Marshall Plan is concerned. And also we should know for the purposes of clarity that the Marshall Plan is a long-term goal, but the short-term goal is promoting infrastructure development on the continent, which is education, which is health infrastructure, which is clean water, and ensuring enough security on the continent. In your view, Ambassador, do you think we should even think of the Marshall Plan as a kind of type of plan that would help to be part of the social economic planning model for the Africa, maybe from 20 to 2060 or not?
Yes, I think, let me go to maybe another slide here. Generally, when you look at what you are talking about is, if you want to build a stable continent, you need to look at the necessities. And those would include housing, they would include education, sanitation, health, education. That's very, very important because those are necessities, they are prerequisites. And whether in a democracy, whether in a dictatorship, all these things are necessary. So that's why I support that a Marshall Plan to Africa should be considered, but countries must be put to task to make sure that all these things are built for the people. They should be built to be able to help the population instead of being given money and the money is stolen. So definitely infrastructure that includes roads, water, railways, education is very, very important. But we must make sure that in doing that, countries which are lagging behind must be put under pressure, first of all, to increase their governance so that they can be able to get those benefits.
Okay. Okay, and the next question comes from David Anga. And the question is, Ambassador, how do we unite countries, especially that African countries seem to operate independently? And you've said what made the Marshall Plan to succeed was because of the collaborative effort.
Yes, you see, how African countries currently, through the African Free Trade Area and the African Union are trying to come together. They have come to a realization that fragmentation is a problem. And so they are coming together to be able to build those kind of synergies that bring together a customs union, common market, so that Africa becomes integrated. If that one is done, then what you're asking for is possible. But as long as African states are fragmented, it is very difficult because they are not united. They have got tariffs, both statutory and non-statutory tariffs, non-trade barriers. And that makes it very difficult for Africa to work together and to develop as a commonality. So it's quite important that we move towards a common market, a customs union, to make sure that it is possible to look at Africa as a totality.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Kayumba, for the listeners and participants. I take a pleasure to come from Rwanda, and he was once my leader, and we promote democracy. Apparently, you have seen the tangible knowledge that he has shared. But I want also to remind the listeners that Ambassador Kayumba has survived 2 assassination attempts in South Africa. So he's a survivor, if we would so call it, but with the potential knowledge, and that shows you how much dictatorship is deadly of. Imagine wishing that such a kind of a human being shouldn't be existing. If you have seen, I had to name him different names. I did it intentionally, but I wanted freedom to be on this panel. And since we are promoting democracy and freedom, there is no way I would just say, well, he's, we are promoting equality and right to life and happiness. If we do so, we do it to all. We may disagree in ideas. We may disagree in ideology. We may disagree in opinions. But by the end of the day, there is nobody who has got a right to take one's life off this earth just because you don't agree. That would be, take me also to the issue of racism and unrest here. My dear Americans, I am an American, a new American, but with zeal and determination to make America great. Just like I love Africa, I love America. I want to see it being a fruitful continent for all the people who are living in it. When we consider all the good things that love has brought on earth, I think we can promote love as opposed to hate. I also know that not all people in the community are bad. What happened to George Floyd, that is one apple. Not all whites are that way. I have worked with the tremendous, important, and very wonderful whites who are very wonderful and useful. We have to stand and say, if we have one apple in the community, we are not going to stand with one apple. But also I know that my fellow Blacks, like Nelson Mandela said, when he was getting out of jail, he realized that once he does not forgive, there would have been a possibility that he was going to live under jail mentally, although he would have left jail physically. So for today, as we close the panel, I urge each Black, of which I am, by the way, to forgive, because reconciliation requires two things. And I come from Rwanda. We had a war-torn country. You had the genocide. Reconciliation takes two people, the victor and the victim, but also to realize that that was done. You teach history as it was, you reset the mind, and you build a nation. And that is my conclusive remarks for this panel. I thank you so much. Tomorrow we have another one, a wonderful one on human rights, building strong institutions. Please be part of the panel. I thank you. We are going now to give 20 minutes for the French translation for the audience that would be on this forum, and that would be Frank Jocaten. Are you there? Frank, are you there? Frank? See, multitasking. Frank, are you there? One moment. Yes. Okay, so the oh yeah, so the floor is yours, please. Hello? Yes, the floor is yours for the French version. Thank you.
Hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Okay. Tout d'abord, j'aimerais vraiment dire merci à tout le monde d'être présent, à toutes les personnes qui ont participé. Nous voulons vous dire merci parce que c'était un événement qui était vraiment très, très, très important pour nous. Ce que le COVID-19 a pu démontrer, c'est que nous sommes tous connectés, en fait. Ce qui se passe dans des pays lointains se passe aussi en Afrique. Et donc, le COVID-19 qui a commencé en Chine a affecté non seulement la Chine, mais a affecté le monde entier. Et nous voulons dire ici à tout le monde que nous sommes connectés. Et parce que nous sommes connectés, il est important pour chacun de nous de pouvoir résoudre les problèmes ensemble. La jeunesse aujourd'hui, en particulier la jeunesse africaine, a soif de démocratie et elle a soif aussi d'infrastructure. Elle veut pouvoir diriger son propre destin. Et donc, quand j'entends parler du plan Marshall et que j'entends toutes les bonnes choses que les hommes et les femmes ont dit avant moi, c'est une très bonne chose. Le plan Marshall est une très bonne chose. Mais je pense qu'il y a une erreur que le monde a commise en ce qui concerne l'Afrique. C'est que très souvent, quand ils aident l'Afrique, les peuples africains ou la jeunesse africaine, ils préfèrent aider directement les gouvernements africains. La majorité de ces gouvernements ne représentent même pas les intérêts de leur propre peuple parce que ce n'est pas des gouvernements légitimes. Donc, je pense que s'il y a des entités ou il y a des gouvernements extérieurs à l'Afrique qui aimeraient pouvoir aider l'Afrique, il faudrait qu'ils créent un pont entre la jeunesse africaine et là où viendra l'argent pour pouvoir aider ces jeunes Africains afin qu'ils puissent créer leurs propres rêves et influencer leur propre destinée. Ce qui est important à savoir, c'est que la jeunesse africaine est vibrante et aujourd'hui, elle a soif de prendre son destin en main. Elle est de plus en plus intelligente et elle est de plus en plus mobile. De plus en plus, ces Africains quittent l'Afrique pour aller dans d'autres horizons, aux États-Unis, en Asie et en Europe, pour s'éduquer. Donc, ils savent comment le monde fonctionne, mais ils ont tous leur regard vers leur continent d'origine. Et ils veulent rentrer et ils veulent pouvoir participer. Les Africains qui sont même en Afrique eux-mêmes, ils s'éduquent à cause de l'Internet, ils ont la possibilité de pouvoir acquérir des connaissances qu'ils ne peuvent pas acquérir dans leur propre pays parce que les institutions ne les servent pas de manière adéquate. Donc, l'Africain en général est en train de se développer, est en train de développer ses talents. Et il est important donc pendant cette période de Covid-19, qu'en Afrique, on se rend compte que cette jeunesse qui a soif de pouvoir s'exprimer et qui a soif de pouvoir créer des opportunités pour elle, elle est là. Mais elle a besoin qu'on ait un gouvernement, d'un état de droit et de la bonne gouvernance dans les pays respectifs afin que cette jeunesse puisse pouvoir s'exprimer. Il est important que l'on sache que dans le monde entier, les jeunes sont en train de se lever. Pas seulement en Afrique, mais dans le monde entier. On voit ce qui se passe aux États-Unis. Je suis surpris de voir beaucoup de jeunes dans les rues de Washington, dans les rues de Chicago, Atlanta et un peu partout dans les États-Unis, en France, en Belgique, en Allemagne, un peu partout dans le monde, les jeunes sont en train de se lever parce qu'ils sont conscients que la manière dont le monde est en train d'évoluer en ce moment n'est pas bonne. On ne peut pas permettre à un certain groupe de personnes de pouvoir évoluer et écraser les autres. Non, on doit résoudre les problèmes ensemble. Et il est donc important que nous comprenions que tous les hommes sont créés égaux devant Dieu. Et par conséquent, tous nous avons le droit à la poursuite du bonheur et à la recherche du bonheur et à la vie. Comme l'a très bien dit Marie, aucun homme n'a le droit de pouvoir tuer un autre homme. Donc, il faut qu'en Afrique, si les gens disent qu'ils aiment vraiment l'Afrique, qu'ils doivent voir l'Afrique d'une autre manière. C'est-à-dire ils doivent arrêter absolument de soutenir ces gouvernements qui sont non seulement mafieux, mais qui sont oppressifs envers leur peuple. Donc oui, je suis pour un plan Marshall, mais je suis aussi pour que les Africains eux-mêmes décident de leur propre destinée. Il est bon pour nous de comprendre que maintenant, on doit prendre notre destin en main. Et donc, on doit trouver des solutions qui sont adaptées à nos réalités, des solutions africaines. Maintenant, si les autres veulent nous aider à implémenter notre propre vision de l'Afrique et notre propre vision du monde, nous serons absolument d'accord de vous joindre et de travailler ensemble. Et comme la Marie l'a si bien dit, nous sommes tous dans ce monde. Ce monde appartient à Dieu et tout ce qu'il renferme. Donc, il est important pour nous de prendre conscience qu'il y a un être qui est au-dessus de nous tous et que c'est dans l'intérêt de l'humanité tout entière que l'on s'entende et que l'on se comprenne et que l'on travaille ensemble afin de pouvoir éradiquer tous les maux qui sont sur cette terre-là. Je sais qu'on m'a donné 20 minutes, mais je ne veux pas tirer encore plus long. Je vais donner la parole donc à Jacques Roger s'il veut pouvoir ajouter quelque chose d'autre ou s'il veut poser des questions, me poser des questions pour pouvoir vous éclairer. Le terrain est libre et je donnerai donc la parole à Monsieur Jacques Roger.
Oui, merci beaucoup, hein, Franck. Je crois que ça a été un débat assez intéressant. Malheureusement, ceux qui parlent le français, nos amis francophones, n'ont pas eu cette possibilité donc d'avoir toutes les informations. C'était une très, très bonne émission. Mais de façon générale, Franck, je sais que vous avez fait un petit résumé de ce qui s'est passé, mais de façon générale, qu'est-ce qu'on peut retenir de la première journée donc, de la conférence?
De façon générale, ce que l'on peut retenir, c'est que tout est possible en Afrique et que l'Afrique, il y a de l'espoir pour l'Afrique. Et que le monde est conscient aujourd'hui qu'il faut inclure l'Afrique dans l'économie mondiale. Il faut inclure les Africains dans ce qui se passe dans le monde. On ne peut plus rester en marge. L'Afrique ne peut pas rester derrière. L'Afrique doit se développer parce qu'elle fait partie du monde et que quand l'Afrique se développe et se porte bien, c'est le monde entier qui se portera mieux. L'économie mondiale se portera mieux parce que l'Afrique aura pris sa place prépondérante. Nous avons aussi parlé un peu de ce qui s'est passé aux États-Unis avec George Floyd, qui est déplorable, et nous disons que la vie de tout individu a de la valeur et que le monde entier est de plus en plus conscient que l'on ne peut pas opprimer ou oppresser quelqu'un à cause de la couleur de sa peau.
Alors, on parle de plus en plus d'un plan Marshall. Selon donc les panélistes, quels sont donc j'allais dire ce qu'il faut pour la réussite donc d'un plan Marshall? Est-ce que le plan Marshall, bon, on peut le dire que l'Afrique a bénéficié de beaucoup d'aide, mais jusqu'à présent, l'Afrique reste encore sous-développée. Alors, qu'est-ce qui nous dit aujourd'hui qu'un plan Marshall ne va pas nous ramener pratiquement à ce que nous avons déjà connu, M. Franck?
Tout à fait. Et j'ai beaucoup aimé en particulier la participation de l'ambassadeur qui disait tout simplement que ça ne sert à rien de pouvoir débloquer des fonds et de l'attribuer à des États qui sont oppressifs, à des États qui tuent leur peuple, à des États où l'argent qui est reçu est pris pour aller réinvestir aux États-Unis ou réinvestir en Europe et ne rien faire pour leur peuple. Voilà pourquoi il faut créer un pont, je pense, un pont direct entre les banques ou bien les États qui veulent aider l'Afrique et les populations africaines. Parce qu'il y a beaucoup de gouvernements en Afrique qui ne sont pas légitimes, qui s'imposent et ils ont pris le pouvoir par la force et ils s'imposent à leur peuple. Et ils n'ont pas l'intérêt de leur nation ni l'intérêt de leur peuple à cœur. Donc, il faut que l'on trouve un mécanisme qui permet donc à cet argent d'aller directement dans les communautés, dans cette jeunesse qui veut pouvoir influencer le destin de son continent. Et j'aimerais aussi pouvoir dire qu'il est important que l'Afrique aussi ait une politique globale, parce qu'il ne faudrait pas que quand on nous donne de l'argent, on donne de l'argent seulement à des États. Il faudrait que l'on donne de l'argent à des régions en Afrique, qu'on ait un plan qui nous permet de développer l'Afrique de manière régionale, non pas de manière pays par pays. Donc, il y a beaucoup de travail d'abord à faire, je pense, du niveau de l'Afrique, où nous devons nous unir. Et il est important que même en Afrique, nous cessons de penser tribu. Nous devons penser nation, nous devons même penser continent. Parce que c'est dans l'intérêt de l'Afrique que l'Afrique devient l'États-Unis d'Afrique. Je pense que lorsque nous sommes unis, nous sommes plus forts et nous pouvons faire plus de choses pour le bien de tous les Africains.
Merci beaucoup. Comme vous l'avez pratiquement suivi, la première journée a été déjà assez intéressante. La deuxième journée, ça sera encore demain, même heure, à partir donc de 13h30 GMT. Hein. Ça sera au niveau donc des États-Unis aux environs donc de 9h30. Et nous allons avoir encore d'autres panélistes. Alors, nous allons laisser donc le gros micro à Marie et à ses invités, à Dr Samuel, qui sont tous en ligne, Dr Freeman. Alors, Franck, vous avez donc le dernier mot et puis vous pouvez tendre le micro à qui vous voulez.
Il n'y a pas de souci. Merci beaucoup, Jacques Roger. Comme je disais, on veut vraiment inviter la communauté francophone aussi à participer. On sait que la communauté anglophone en Afrique est très développée. On pense probablement parce qu'ils sont influencés par une culture anglo-saxonne, mais il est important que l'Afrique francophone ne reste pas derrière. Que nous aussi, nous sommes des Africains qui sont dans le continent africain et nous avons aussi notre rôle à jouer. Et notre rôle n'est pas qu'un rôle culturel, mais c'est aussi un rôle économique et politique et social sur tout l'étendue du territoire. Donc, je vais donner maintenant la parole à Marie qui va donc clôturer cette session. I will give the word to Mary now and she will close.
Mary? So let's go for Dr. Hancock then.
I think we're finished for the day. Unless anyone else, Mary, do we have any other closing remarks that you want to make, or we're about done?
We are about done. Actually, what I was going to say was to thank each and everybody, you in particular, for the wonderful job done. All the speakers, I can't thank you enough on behalf of Watch Democracy Grow. And again, tomorrow we are starting at the same time. Hopefully from here, we are going to just a little bit, do quick correction so that we don't get a little bit of the confusion we had for this one. When you are starting, it's always going to be that way. But the second day, it should go smoothly. But just a small, maybe crossing would be a story of the Democratic Convention, which happened in 1924. For those ones who did American history, you know it. When I saw what is happening now, it reminded me of that class. That was one of the hardest, and I think what we are facing here in the US. But the candidates of that time, there was an issue of racial supremacy, then there was an issue of freedom of religion, racial tolerance, and so on. The two things I remember, there are two candidates. The Alfred Smith, from the governor of New York. He ran for election, not because he wanted to win, but